Clay, y'all. Merle Hillbilly here. And I got stories so creepy they'll make your knees knock. So put on your best flannel shirt and grab a jug of moonshine, because we're about to venture into a world of pure terror. When I was younger, I used to go to a place called Desolation Wilderness near Camino, California. It was the perfect place for camping and fishing. Realizing that it had been a few years since my last trip, I talked a friend of mine into going camping and fishing. We managed to talk another friend into coming with us, and then we were off. We arrived around 1 p.m. and decided to hike upstream from a place called Wright's Lake. When we found a good spot, we would set up camp. After walking for a couple of hours, a ranger found us hiking and told us that we actually weren't even technically in Desolation Wilderness yet, and that we needed to keep hiking a bit longer. I started tearing down the camp, but I guess the other two guys were not as enthusiastic about the trip as I was. They left for Placerville to find a hotel room. When they left, I hiked up a bit farther, but I started to worry about the amount of time I had to find a place and set up my camp before dark. As I hiked, I tried to remember the ranger's instructions, but I ended up getting lost. Finally, I found a granite cliff with a stream that had a beautiful pool of water and was right on the tree line. I thought it was perfect, so I set up camp and started fishing. When the sun had set and the sky was dark, I decided to go to sleep. Cozy in my sleeping bag, I started to drift off. But then, I heard something growl outside my tent. I grabbed the .45 compact handgun from its case and looked down through the screen on the front of the tent. From where I was standing, I could only see a dark figure, about 4.5 feet tall, standing near the trees. Thinking it was a bear, I started yelling, hoping to scare it away. It didn't move, so I fired a shot at a dead tree nearby. That startled it, and it ran back into the forest, but to my surprise, it didn't go very far. I climbed back into my tent, then I heard crashing sounds. It was the sound of rocks falling off the cliff and hitting the pool below. This was unnerving. I climbed out of my tent a few times, but I couldn't see anything, even though the moon was bright and the white granite rocks reflected its light. Crashing rocks hit every few minutes until around 2 a.m. Then it stopped. But I heard something rustling just outside my tent. I yelled at it and tried to scare it off, but instead of leaving, I heard a very deep growling sound in return. At this point, I didn't want to wait until it got too close. So I got out of my tent and looked around. Nothing. I decided to shoot the tree again to see if the creature would react and run back in the forest again, just like the first time. But it stopped again. As I listened to the sounds of its movement, I realized it was running on 2 feet. This was not a bear. I didn't want to go back into my tent. I grabbed my sleeping bag and moved over to the middle of a big slab of white granite nearby. I felt safer. I knew the forest was farther away from me, but I could still hear the noise of rocks crashing. I prayed the sun would come up soon. At about 4:30 in the morning, I was awoken from my light sleep. I looked back at the trees but didn't see anything. Then I looked back over at my tent. There it was, standing at the side of my tent. I panicked, picked up my gun, and shot at the side of the creature, but it didn't flinch. Then, with giant steps, it walked toward me. I shot at it again. I wasn't sure if a .45 would even stop such a beast, but it was my only hope. After the second shot rang out, it ran off into the trees. Shaking like a leaf, I sat down clutching my gun. I waited for hours until the light started to appear in the sky. I broke camp and headed back down to Wright's Lake. That was the last time I saw the creature. That was also the last time I went to Desolation Wilderness, and I will never go back. In northern Canada, I went deep into the wilderness with my father and my eldest brother to hunt for moose. We left in the early morning just before sunrise, trying to cover as much distance as possible before nightfall. We traveled winding rivers and had to repeatedly portage over rapids all day. We decided to set up camp just over halfway to our destination. My father figured that we'd make the rest of the journey tomorrow. When everyone bedded down for the night, I decided to go grab some firewood and relieve myself down by the bank of the river, just out of reach of the light from the campfire. Out from the tree line, about 15 yards away, I could hear rustling in the bushes. I watched the area where I heard the noise and focused on that spot. I felt kind of funny, dizzy, lightheaded. Then I could smell this putrid stink, like old milk or rotten food. Then I saw the trees start to morph and move ever so slightly and begin to take the shape of a head and slight facial features. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and along the tree line I could hear a voice coming from there. I recognized the voice. It sounded like one of my relatives who had recently passed. The face took the shape of my relative. "Hello," they said. "I have missed you. Come see me." I smiled and stepped forward a bit, but stopped to analyze the situation. My relative's face stopped smiling and became emotionless. The skin began to turn pale and peel away. Chunks of flesh from their cheeks began to fall away, and I felt shock and fear overwhelm my body. I couldn't make sense of it at all. I started to back away and make my way to camp. I didn't realize at the time that I'd been walking toward the voice and was further away from the firelight. The voice became angry and began shouting at me to come here. I turned to run away, but as I looked back one more time, I saw the most disgusting thing I had ever seen. It was rotting flesh on knotted bone, caved-in eyes, and a hollow chest cavity. This humanoid creature was tall and super thin. I ran as fast as I could, trying to yell for help, but fear made my voice quiet and raspy. I ran along the riverbank and could hear heavy breaths and the stomping feet of this thing right behind me. I made it to the top of the riverbank, but it grabbed hold of my leg as I jumped up. I gripped and tore at the grass, trying to lift myself, and yelled as loud as I could. Finally, my voice came back, and I screamed that someone had my leg. My brother woke up and ran over to where I was. He pulled me up and took me over to the fire. I was terrified, trying to explain what I saw and that it looked like my relative. I was trying to convince them I wasn't seeing things, but my brother nodded his head and said, "I saw it too." That solidified it. He acknowledged that it was real. We stayed up all night after that, rifles loaded and close by. We packed up when the sun came up and went back home. We haven't shared that story with anyone out of fear of being labeled as crazy or liars. I had nightmares and couldn't sleep for months afterward. I would see things, dark figures looking into my window, or hear whispers when I was walking home at night. Eventually, I was seeing this dark figure daily. I went to a medicine man, a shaman, for help, but I learned that the ceremonies only relieved it temporarily. Friends have given me everything from protection pouches to certain crystals. I found out that there's a strong possibility that I encountered a Wendigo. I learned that if you encounter one and survive, it attaches itself to you like a parasite. I learned that it can only do this if it touches you, which it did. Ever since that night, I've been on edge when I enter any forest or wooded area, which sucks because I love being outdoors and hunting and in nature. Now I always feel like I need to keep my back against something when I'm out in the wild. Anyways, make your own conclusions about this. I've paid a price for being an ignorant child to the stories of old. They are real. I can attest to that. Stay safe, everyone. This story happened to a friend of mine, and I share it here with his permission. My friend described what he experienced as follows. In 1986, there was no electricity or road in the village. The villagers had to go to Elazığ, a city in Turkey, to meet their needs. The road to the center was 2 or 3 kilometers from the village. It was necessary to be on this road at 4:30 a.m. to reach Elazığ. There was only one car that went there, and it came back around noon. The road used to go through what was called Kandere, Demon Creek, by the villagers, and they thought strange events happened there and that it wasn't auspicious. Me and 2 of my friends started preparing at 3 a.m. to hit the road. The road we had to cross that included the Demon Creek to reach Elazığ was on our minds. First, we planned to cross the Ridgeway, then the Demon Creek, and enter the highway that leads to Elazığ. Afterward, we hit the road. We lit our cigarettes while being in deep conversation. It was utter darkness. There wasn't even moonlight. We were slowly encouraging ourselves to cross the Demon Creek. Thinking about that moment, we were getting close to it. But first, we had to cross the ridgeway. The path was so narrow that two people could not walk side by side, and it was filled with big bushes. We were moving in a single line. I was the last one in the row. The first guy in the row, named Kamal, suddenly stopped. He mentioned that there was a black dog watching us without moving. On the way, I thought to myself, it's one of our village dogs. My friends were very nervous. We were getting more scared because of the stories we had heard since childhood. Now I was scared too and started reciting Bismillah. I smelled and prayed. The dog suddenly got out of the way and disappeared after moving a few meters into the bushes. After the dog had disappeared, we thought to ourselves, what was the dog doing there? And continued to walk. After walking for 1 to 2 minutes, Camille suddenly stopped again and yelled, "It's the same dog again," before moving a few steps back. The three of us didn't know what to do because of confusion and fear. The dog was looking at us again. I recited Bismillah again. The dog stood up and vanished into the bushes once more. My friend said, "Forget it. Let's go back. Let's not go there." But I said, "We need to cross this road. If we don't, then the day after tomorrow, we'll still have to use this road for shopping." I calmed them down, and then we continued on our path. My friends were, of course, still scared. We were talking about why the dog had appeared again. I tried to calm them down by saying, he's just a common dog, and he's following us. We continued on our path. We couldn't believe our eyes when, after 3 to 5 minutes, a cold black goat was standing on the road, blocking the way. We were so scared, we started to pray and recite Bismillah. The goat suddenly disappeared. Its disappearance made me comprehend that these events weren't ordinary at all, and we were now seriously scared. But going back was not an option. I calmed my nerves, moved to the front of the group, and guided my friends. I was both praying and leading the way. There was only one sharp corner left before Demon Creek. We were shocked when we finished crossing the sharp corner. What we saw was indescribable. A long, white as snow, shining silhouette-shaped mass. Whatever it was obvious that it had arms and legs, but its face was ambiguous. Then it started to create sounds, rumbling, screaming, crying. We closed our ears with our hands. We were throwing ourselves on the ground in fear and flailing. At the same time, it was blindingly bright. I started to recite my known prayers. My friends were yelling, cursing, and completely disoriented. I was thinking about how to escape the situation while staying calm. I dragged my friends away from the incident. As we escaped, the screaming turned into laughter. The laughter echoed in our minds. We headed back to the village, but we didn't know how we managed to return. At the entrance of the village, there was the house of Camille. When Camille's parents saw us, they couldn't believe their eyes. "What's the matter with you?" they asked. Our faces were pale. We couldn't speak, trembling and making noises like dummies. They informed our relatives, who also came. They tried to grasp the situation. I rested for a while, drank some water, and told them the story. The villagers were stunned. They told us to thank God that we came back in one piece. We thought we had saved ourselves, but from sunrise to sunset for 40 days, we had heavy headaches, skin rashes, and huge herpes sores on our lips. Later, I was driving home from work on a 6-lane highway heading west in Hamilton, Ontario. As I drove on my side of the highway, I saw a dog cross from the left side to the right. That area is full of trees, bushes, channels, and ravines, offshoots of Lake Ontario. When I saw the dog, it was approximately half a kilometer ahead of me. The astonishing thing about this dog, I'm certain it was a dog, was that its length from nose to rump, excluding its tail, covered almost the full width of the lane, 8 feet. It was heading back into a small valley filled with heavy forest and a ravine. I couldn't believe a dog could grow to that size. I still remind my boyfriend of this occasionally. I have no witnesses. This happened to me in July of this year, and I've been thinking about it constantly since. I'll try to sum up the experience as best I can. I'm kind of a mentally ill weirdo. I have borderline personality disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'm a 24-year-old girl who lives alone in the city. just minding my own business. I have a few friends, but I'm not close with my family. It's not unusual for me to go a few weeks or months without really seeing anyone besides coworkers, especially during the pandemic. So I've just been doing my own thing. This encounter happened during one of those few-week stretches of isolation. I'm only giving this bit of exposition so people can understand my psych history and mental state, etc. So, at the start of July, I got this uncontrollable impulse to go camping and stargazing. I never go camping alone, hadn't gone in 4 years, and had no camping gear whatsoever. But I wanted to go for some reason. I researched some good dark sky spots in Utah, found a cute little campground about 4 hours into the desert, and reserved the last spot available for a week later. I bought all my stuff the day before and just drove up. I'm horrible at planning and time management, so by the time I arrived at the campground, the sun was already going down. I had also forgotten my charger and realized I had to make my 60% battery last until I made it back to the city. There was no service out there, so that seemed easy enough. My entire goal was to chill in my hammock chair all night and stargaze anyway, so all I needed was some music. I specifically chose the night of a new moon for this. I knew I had to get my tent set up and situated before the sun went down. There were a lot of others there, but most were families with kids getting ready for bed. I could hear parents reading scripture to their kids before bed, Mormons, and others reading Kindles. By the time everything was set up, it was about 10 p.m. Almost everyone turned off their lights and went to sleep. This really weirded me out at first. It was the perfect night for stargazing. I didn't see a single other person setting up a chair, no telescopes, no one even outside their tents looking up. Eventually, I figured they all probably just wanted to wake up with the sunrise. Sleeping in wouldn't exactly be pleasant in the desert heat. I worked night shifts, so staying up wasn't an issue at all. At this point, the only people I could see awake were myself, a family vaguely near me reading scripture, and a whole mess of people at the bathroom. My tent was located at the far side of the campground. To my left, nothing but desert and cliff. In front of me, the bathroom, about 100 feet away. Behind me, and to the right, the rest of the campground. There was another bathroom on the far side of the campground behind me, probably around 700 to 900 feet away. These two bathrooms were the only sources of light in the campground, aside from a few people using flashlights to go to and from the bathroom. Like I said, I'm a bit of a weirdo, which makes telling this story honestly to others hard. My goal on this trip was to grieve and move on from a lot of loss I experienced the year before. A lot of bad stuff happened, and I lost many loved ones. Sometimes a good mushroom trip can really help find closure when it comes to grief. That was my only goal. I took around 2 grams and was coming up around 11 p.m. Now, hear me out. What kind of close encounter story is believable when the person telling it was on psychedelics? It's a fair question. I agree that skepticism is warranted. That said, I have a gross amount of experience with psychedelics. I've tripped in even weirder and more isolated places than this. I've tripped on mushrooms dozens of times and on acid over 100. I've kept tons of trip journals and recordings. Never once has anything like this happened before or since. I've never seen things or entities, never had paranoia about something being there that wasn't. My trips are always the same. Textures get wavy, emotions heighten, I feel peace in my mind. That's it. I'm convinced what happened in the desert wasn't caused by the drugs. It simply happened while I was tripping. It would have happened even if I hadn't taken anything. That's just my opinion, though. I definitely invite skepticism. So I was coming up ready to stargaze. I needed to pee, though, and all the people hanging around the bathroom were making me nervous. No one else seemed to be awake. No lights on, no tent flaps open. Eventually, I caved and went to the bathroom. No one bothered me. I started walking back to my chair. My spot was close to the bathroom, and I could walk from the front of it in a straight line in the dark and always hit my tent in about 25 seconds. Because it was that easy, I didn't bother turning on my flashlight. Plus, saving my phone battery was still a priority. As I walked through the dark, I saw the outline of my hammock chair and a person standing right next to it, staring at it. I froze and stared. I was super confused. Why was this person in my camp spot, alone in the dark, staring at my chair? Maybe they were curious. I waved at them, but they didn't respond. I moved closer, and I guess the sound of my footsteps alerted them, because they shot their head up toward me, took around 3 steps in my direction, then backed up about 6 steps, flashed a bluish flashlight in my eyes, and fast walked toward another person I hadn't noticed, who had also been standing silently in the dark, about 15 feet away. They both stand next to each other, shining their blue flashlights at their feet, and they both move around me towards the bathroom and disappear into the girls' restroom. Weird, right? I thought so. Standing there all terrified like a dumbass, I rationalized that the first person must have been waiting for their friend to catch up or something. I sit down and finally put on some good music in my headphones and just melt into the beautiful show playing in the sky above. It's now around 11:30 to midnight, and there are still people messing around near the women's restroom. It's actually just really distracting at this point and bugging me a lot because it's right in my line of sight. They just keep waving their flashlights around and coming in and out, but they never seem to go anywhere. They'll walk out of the restroom, turn their lights off, and just walk into the dark without their lights to guide them. They usually either walk behind the bathroom where I can't see them, or off to the left side into the dark where there are no camp spots. I notice someone is standing next to me. I tear my headphones out and shoot my head to my right. There is a silhouette of a person standing about 7 feet from my chair. I am frozen and spooked pretty bad. They take around 2 or 3 steps towards me, then back up again around 6 and walk around me and away into the dark with no flashlight, away from me in the bathroom. Now I'm spooked. I don't think it's anything supernatural right now, but I definitely think it's some people up to no good. The nearest city is hundreds of miles away, and we aren't far from any civilization out here. If these were people trying to hurt me, they could do it rather easily. I stay in the chair for now, but I keep my headphones off so I can hear the environment around me. My head is now on a swivel, but I'm still trying my best to enjoy the night. Now it's midnight, and no one else is awake. No flashlights anywhere, no voices, nothing. All the bathroom people finally vanished, and it was just me awake as far as I could tell. With my headphones off, I started to notice sounds now. The sound of a jet somewhere near would come and go, flying around somewhere in the desert. I kept looking for its craft lights, but could never find them. This deep, almost physics-defying boom would occasionally shake the desert, but in a weird way. When I heard and felt it, I would feel my body tense and shake with it in the air too, but never the ground. It's weird because it sounded as if it was coming from the ground itself, not the air. I would also hear what sounded like laughter coming from the desert to my left, the portion with no camp spots or people. I'm still at this point just chilling. I'm obviously starting to suspect some weird shit, but for the most part, I'm chilling and enjoying the night. Then, orbs in the sky. I practically shit myself when I saw this. Above one of the cliffs far out on the horizon, a little swarm of glowing orbs appeared. They were almost dancing around one another. I remember this moment very, very clearly, and I remember seeing them and thinking, I can't explain that. What the fuck is that? There is nothing I could imagine that could move like that. Not even drones. I won't record this, I promise. It would ruin it, and I want to see it through. I remember thinking that last part very clearly. Out of nowhere, and I thought it was weird how specific it was in my mind. I hadn't even thought to record it in the first place, as I just noticed it. But here, I was making a promise to myself that I wouldn't even try, no matter what would happen. Another cluster of orbs appears in the sky to my right, and almost simultaneously, the orbs to my left instantly shoot across the sky to join the other orbs. I start smiling like an idiot. This is it. The thing I've been staring at the sky looking for my whole life. The thing I stopped believing in for decades because I never saw it and let the world convince me that it was just as boring as it appeared, and never once allowed myself to think it could actually be more than that. And the proof of that was finally staring me in the face. I had to keep checking in with myself, being like, this isn't the shrooms, right? No, it's definitely not. I see that, and I know I'm not hallucinating. I probably went through that little personal questioning close to a dozen times over the course of the next few minutes. The jet sound comes back, and it's much louder now. I can actually see the aircraft lights now too, flying directly overhead, but they aren't blinking like usual. They fly into this dark cloud in the sky I hadn't noticed before, and vanish along with the jet sound. The orbs continue playing around each other until they vanish too. All in all, I'd say this lasted for like an hour. It's now around 1 a.m., and I really gotta pee. Obviously, I hold it as long as I can because I am witnessing the single most special thing I'll ever get to see right in front of my eyes. But eventually, I break and just want to get it over with. So, I'm a trans woman. I wouldn't even bring that up if it didn't have some sort of relevance to the story. To be honest, I look and sound exactly like a girl. It's pretty much impossible for people to tell I'm not cis, and I haven't been clocked in a long time. But I still have a penis. I'm out here in the desert, on shrooms, witnessing some high strangeness. But I still gotta be careful what bathroom I use. Normally I would just use the girls, but those people I encountered earlier were still making me paranoid. So I figured, if worse comes to worst, I'd rather be caught in the men's in case there are some weirdos out here. And there I am, doing my thing at the urinal as fast as possible, zip down and start going. The moment I start, the door to the restroom shoots the fuck open. Some guy with short brown hair, around 5'6.5", with a sunken, droopy face, runs in, eyes glued to the ground, and barges into the stall next to me, shutting the door and doing his business. The only word I could use to describe him was he looked sick. This obviously scares the fuck out of me. It's like 1 a.m. I haven't seen another human being in a few hours. I just saw the light show in the sky, and I'm a sass-looking girl peeing standing up at a urinal, alone with this dude. He pees for, no joke, 3 seconds. That's it. All that rush, all that urgency, for 3 seconds of tinkle time. Who does that? He spent the rest of his time in there slowly pulling out toilet paper from the roller for some reason. I'm a dumb bitch and just held my bladder for way too long, so I'm trying my best to just get it all out so I can leave, but it's taking forever. I finally finish and, for some reason, go to wash my hands. I don't know why. It just felt like the right thing to do in the moment. LMAO. The guy shoots out of the stall again, way too hard and fast, comes in right next to me at the sink, washes his hands for a total of 2 seconds, and leaves the bathroom as fast as he entered. I'm just kind of shook. But again, I'm trying to rationalize this. I just think he's probably tripping too, and the sight of some girl peeing at the urinal at 1 a.m. probably made him think I was an alien. So I head out and back to my chair. The moment I sit down, the lights in the bathroom I was just in shut off all at once. Both the girls' and boys' bathrooms. No one enters or leaves either. Now, just a single tiny yellow bulb can be seen glowing above a park ranger's bulletin board on the side of the building. I sit down and almost can't help but invite more weird stuff to happen around me. The jets are back now, and louder than before. There are orbs now, a huge ring around the campground, pulsating and growing, then dimming slowly, drifting around. I'm terrified, but I also can't move. It's too cool. Honestly, that's really the whole reason I didn't hide in my tent. Who in their right mind would listen to their instincts to run when you could see how far it could go? I hear weirder sounds coming from the desert, what sounds like shouting and a baby crying, far, far away. The orbs reappear in the sky and behind the trees next to my tent. It looks like the moon is shining through, but it's a new moon. It's now 2 a.m. The bathroom lights come back on, but only in the men's restroom. The women's remain off, and I see no one come or go. At this point, the only thing that has come out of my mouth for a while is, I'm a dumb. Why am I doing this? This is terrifying, and I'm dumb for just letting it happen. I'm very aware of my desire to run and give in to the fear, but that's highly outweighed by my curiosity. At least it was. Until a person came from seemingly nowhere with no flashlight and no clear direction. They walked in front of the bathroom, and it was terrifying. Normally, that wouldn't be scary. It's just a person. But this person was easily 10 to 13 feet tall. The bathroom itself is around 13 feet tall, and this person's head was level with the top ventilation window. The crown of their head was taller than the building itself. They walked in front of the restroom and into the dark, and I shot out of my chair. The only thing I said was, "Nope, nope, that's my line. That's terrifying. Nope, nope," or something like that. As fast as I could, I ran into my tent and quickly zipped it up. There was no not running at this point. My sympathetic nervous system took over completely and was very adamant that I needed to hide. It's hard to describe what I felt, but it was the most primal fear I've ever felt. I have borderline personality disorder and complex PTSD, so I'm used to feeling a staggering amount of terror in my mind on a daily basis when my symptoms show up. But this was on a whole other level. It was like some deep animal part of me understood the moment I saw them that I was no longer at the top of the food chain. Another ultra predator, much smarter than me, had just made itself known. My body tensed up like a wild animal at the sight of it. I felt truly humble and small in that moment and knew I was outmatched. They were now outside my tent, scurrying in non-circles. The sound of their footsteps gave way to the feeling of their voice playing side by side with my own inner voice. This is where it gets hard to explain. We talked, but talking isn't the right word. They communicated in pure concept and feeling. It was so subtle and instantaneous that it's hard to describe how obvious it felt, while also being so subtle it could almost be indistinguishable from my own thoughts or emotions. The things we talked about were rather personal, so I won't go into too much detail. I asked them about the jets, whether that was us, and if we were trying to find them. They said yes. I said, "But we aren't smart enough to find you guys." They said, "No, you are smart. You just aren't creative." They said they are scared of us too, but are much more aware of us than we are of them. They want to know us more, but it's hard. Too much complication. They cited me running and hiding as proof. I said, "That's natural. I'm still an animal with a nervous system hardwired for survival. Something new and unknown is going to do that to people, no matter how rational they try to stay." They said they liked me because I was honest about the fear. They were scared too. They want freedom, and they want that for us as well, but they aren't quite sure what to do, or at least they wouldn't tell me. Whenever I would ask their name or why they were here, they would deliberately ignore me. They also seemed to get a kick out of messing with me, also citing that as a reason for the contact. They did one thing that really stuck with me. They showed me that they have always cared and always will. It's hard to describe the feeling they gave me, but it really was unconditional love. They called me family and kept expressing their love for me. They told me that I chose this. I didn't really get that part, but when they said it, all these memories from my childhood flooded in. I'm still struggling to draw any connections. After a while, of course, I had to pee again. I did, and nothing happened. I went back into my tent, ate some trail mix, and recorded an audio note of what we had just talked about so I could remember as much as possible. Then I noticed the time on my phone said something like 11 a.m. My phone has never messed up like that before, changed the time on me. It was a little validating to see, to be honest. It was very clearly still the middle of the night, not 11 a.m. I left the tent and they messed with me some more. More orbs in the trees, lights going off in the bathrooms, etc. Eventually 5 a.m. hit and they were gone. The sun came up and I headed home. There's a lot of detail I skipped over as this post is already way too long, but there you have it. Like I said, I don't expect anyone to believe me. I invite the skepticism, honestly, I was under the influence of a psychedelic substance, but I have to say, out of the hundreds of trips I've had, I've never experienced something like this before or since. I truly believe that these events happened and that the drugs were not responsible for their inception whatsoever. What to take away from it? I don't know, to be honest. But it was amazing, and I want to meet them again. I am extremely humbled. Now I believe in other beings again and have this sense of family and home in myself I've never quite had before. Has anyone out there met them too? I'd love to hear your story if so, and let you know you aren't alone in your experience. They are out there, and they do exist. Thanks for listening, cowboys and cowgirls. Hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we dive deep into the horror of the American countryside. See you then. Mary and I had been park rangers for over a decade. My story is rather unusual, and you may believe it or not. It started with the missing hikers. At first, I thought they had simply gotten lost or wandered off the trail, but as more and more people went missing, I began to realize that something sinister was at play. Then there were the eerie noises at night, growls and snarls that sent shivers down my spine. I knew I had to investigate. I spent countless hours going through the woods, searching for any signs of the missing hikers or the source of the noises. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find anything. And then one night, it happened. I was walking back to my cabin after a long day of searching when I heard a rustling in the bushes. I reached for my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise, but all I could see were two glowing eyes staring back at me. Before I had a chance to react, the creature lunged at me. It was massive, easily 3,000 pounds, and had 5 legs instead of the usual 4. Its fur was matted and its teeth were bared. I knew in that moment that I was in serious danger. I reached for my gun and fired a shot, hitting the creature in the shoulder. It let out a deafening roar and retreated back into the woods. I was shaken but relieved that I had survived the attack. Over the next few days, I searched the woods for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing. No tracks, no fur, nothing to indicate that it had ever been there. It was as if the creature had vanished into thin air. From that point on, I was on high alert. I never ventured into the woods alone and always carried my gun with me. But no matter how much I prepared, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching and waiting. Days passed without any sign of the creature, and I began to let my guard down. I thought that perhaps I had scared it off for good. But then, one day, I received a strange signal from deep in the woods. It was from a hiker who had gone missing. I knew what I had to do. I gathered a team of search and rescue experts, and we set out into the woods to find the missing hiker. As we searched, we had a feeling that this unknown predator was somewhere near. And then, just as we were about to give up hope, we found him. The missing hiker, alive and well. He told us that he had been wandering through the woods when he heard a rustling in the bushes, and then out of nowhere, the creature had appeared, staring at him with those glowing eyes. But this time, it just growled and went back into the woods. As we made our way back to civilization, I couldn't help but feel relieved that we had found the hiker alive. But I also knew that the creature was still out there. We'd been up on Hooper's Bald Trailhead with the intent of stargazing. However, it was unusually warm for the end of October 2019. Thick fog rolled in around 9 p.m., and we eventually gave up around 11 p.m. We sat and talked to an older couple who had pulled off to spend the night due to the fog, and we eventually left at maybe 1 a.m. from the Hooper Bald Overlook parking area. We made our way back down slowly until the scenic overlook at Chute Cove. By the time we got there, at maybe 1:30 a.m., the fog and most of the clouds had subsided. There is a small parking lot at this overlook that holds maybe 7 cars and a field the size of a soccer pitch separating you from the tree line, with some picnic tables dotted around. We pulled up, got out of the car, turned it off along with the lights, and set up our tripods, cameras, and lenses to take some photos of the stars and try and catch some of the Milky Way if possible on long exposure. We were about 15 to 20 photos in, each exposure being about 30 seconds or so. In this time, no cars passed, no owls hooted, no foxes screamed, only the faint sounds of some bugs and the occasional bat fluttering about. Later on, it was eventually deathly quiet. No sounds, not bugs chirping, nor bats fluttering around, not even leaves rustling in the wind. It was eerie, to say the least. I got the feeling a little uneasy. I can't pinpoint why, but I was getting that fluttery feeling in my chest. We kept taking pictures for a few minutes longer. But as time went on, we could hear some things going on in the woods, namely, what I could best describe as either stones being tossed or shuffling in the tree line. I ignored this for maybe 5 minutes or so. To me, it sounded like it was at our 10 and 2 o'clock positions, relative to where we were. There was also an occasional wood-on-wood sound, but not like a branch falling. It was repetitive and slow, and only one hit, unlike a branch that would hit a lot on its way down. After what sounded like a branch snapping to our 9 or 10 o'clock, my fiancé just said, "Did you hear that?" I said quietly, "Yes." "Was that the first one you heard?" And they responded back, "No, we need to leave." We had both been scanning the tree line, but were unable to see any direct movement. It spooked us both so badly, we packed up the cameras and walked backwards to the car, never turning our backs to the direction of the sounds. We opened the doors, tossed our gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. Basically, as soon as we reached the car. We sat in it for about 2 or 3 minutes after cranking it up and turning on the lights, but never saw anything. I am a fairly avid hiker and primitive or semi-primitive camper, and have run across deer, bear, and even the occasional wild dog or coyote. But nothing has ever just given me the willies before. It was uncanny and unnerving. My fiancé said it was like they just had the primal urge to run, like we were being hunted or stalked. I had the same feeling, like something was there, or a small group of somethings, and they were closing in. By the time we got in the car, I felt like we were prey. We never saw anything. No animal, no creature, no glint of eyes in the tree line. I would like to think we didn't just get scared over nothing, but who knows? Late at night, where we can't see or hear well, our minds can play tricks on us. I've chatted with them before posting this to make sure I recalled it the same way. We had not spoken of it since that trip, but we both have the same impression of the encounter. We both feel like there were at least 2 things starting to flank us, and that we were prey, in my words, or hunted in theirs. I'm not really sure if there are any local lore or creatures of the woods in this area from native tales that would fit this. I am insanely skeptical on all matters of cryptids, but this was just bizarre. Bears don't really do much in groups. Wild canines like wolves and coyotes don't usually flank humans, and I doubt any normal group animal would cross an open field without any cover. I want to explain encounter with something logical, but I'm not quite sure what it was. I had gotten into an argument with my mom about the hat man that was leaning over me while I slept on the couch, something my sister informed me of the following day. A lot of weird stuff happened at that house, but that wasn't the encounter. No, it was after the argument. I was walking out of the house, down the road. We were surrounded by woods, and a small swamp was behind our place. I was walking down the road, which was wooded on both sides. Not many people came down where we were, so I was listening to music on my walk, and I felt like something was watching me. I lived in Alabama, so it was weird. Nobody came into our woods, not ever. I looked over, and there I saw it. He was hunched over and huge. He had pale features and was so skinny I could see his ribcage. The thing that threw me off was his mask-like face. He didn't wear a mask, but his face had mask-like features. The only reason I say his face wasn't wearing a mask was because I could see his mouth perfectly. He had dark eyes. I thought he had eye bags, but maybe I was just trying to reassure myself. I heard a branch crunch under his hand. Or at least I like to assure myself it was his hand. He reminded me of a human, but all wrong. Please, someone tell me they've got some explanation, because I can't. Thank you. I was 4 years old. I have experienced paranormal events my entire life. Sightings, dreams, and premonitions. This is one of my first experiences that I have memory of. We lived in a cedar-sided split-floor home on top of a mountain. I had a younger brother, about 10 months old. We shared a bedroom across the hall from my parents' room. We would see this figure constantly. We saw it so much that we started to just ignore it. It stood about 3 or 4 feet tall, had an outline like a teddy bear, and wore a classic Viking helmet with horns. But we never could see its features, just the dark shadow. Our older cousin, 1 or 2 years older, spent the night one night. Everyone was in a circle with our sleeping bags on the floor of our room. The lights were still on. My cousin immediately whispered, "What is that?" and pointed at the creature who was standing in our doorway, watching us. I told him it was just our monster, and he watches us play. He can't do anything to us or hurt us. I stuck my tongue out at it to assure my cousin the thing was harmless. My mom had told us monsters couldn't get us, so I was extra brave around it. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night. I slept on the top bunk and my brother on the bottom. I saw the creature climbing up the bunk bed ladder to my bed. To this day, I have no idea why or how I was brave enough to do this. But I moved to the ladder and sat in front of it, blocking the creature from coming up. It stopped climbing, but we were inches from each other's faces. It seemed like we sat like that forever, because I remember thinking, what the heck is this? And why can't I see its actual face? I reached out and tapped its shoulder. All hell broke loose as soon as I touched it. I could see all of it. The entire body was covered in monster heads. Its main face had giant eyes and sharp, sharp teeth. It was terrified of me, confused, and seemed to be in intense pain from my touch. It grabbed me by the back and tore my back up, screamed in my face. Of course, I was screaming hysterically. I broke free and crawled to the far end of my bed, started praying, and stopped screaming. By this time, my mom ran in, and all I could say was, "Monster." The next morning, my mom casually made me come into the kitchen to show her best friend my back. As an adult, my mom told me she was so scared that my back was all scratched up. Scratches I didn't have that night at bedtime. I asked my cousin what he saw that night. He admitted to it 30+ years later and told me when I stuck my tongue out, he was terrified. As an adult, my brother described the exact same appearance of it after having a summer encounter shortly after mine. He passed it on our basement stairs and it screamed at him. After my encounter, I never saw it again. My son, who is 3, is terrified of shadows, and he knows the difference between normal shadows. He tells me one walks around in his room. Is it the same thing? What the hell is it? While I was cutting cross-country along the Maxwell Book Trail to some reprieve above my camp, I found 2 impressions in a dung pile unlike any I've seen before. The prints were about a quarter-mile apart, but on the same ridge and identical in size, both having a prominent big toe impression. The dung pile was 12 to 14 inches in length and as big around as a 50-cent piece. I also had a visitor outside my tent at 4 a.m. I was awake and drinking coffee in my dimly lit tent. I keep the gas lantern down low to cut down noise and listen for buggling elk, so I should have heard any animal approach. But I heard nothing, until a sliding, scraping sound followed by a loud thud, like a person sliding at a log or a stump just a few feet outside the tent. I listened for the critter to leave, but I heard no sound. It concerned me that nothing ran away, so I grabbed an axe, went outside, and yelled, but still no movement. It was big. The thud it made was louder than I could make stomping on the ground. I forgot to mention that right before the sound, I heard a low growl that made me look down at my stomach and wonder why I didn't feel my stomach growling. It was low and long. I thought it was me at first. I bought a cottage on Mattagami Lake in June 2000. Mattagami Lake is located approximately 90 kilometers south of Timmins, Ontario, off Highway 144 towards Sudbury. It's a water access cottage, and all the lots in our area are in the 1.5-acre range. We've spent every summer there since. I also grew up spending all my summers at our family cottage since the age of 5, so I'm no stranger to being surrounded by forest. I'm very familiar with the sounds of nature and wildlife in the area. As kids, we used to wander off into the odd logging roads behind the cottage in the middle of the night. No flashlights, no care in the world. We never came across anything remotely scary, strange, or unexplained. Anyway, back to adulthood. One night about 10 years ago, my wife and I were at the cottage on an early spring weekend. I believe it was either late April or early May. The only other people around that weekend were our neighbors, 2 doors down on one side, and my wife's parents, 3 doors down on the other. I know our neighbors well. They're in their 70s and never wander outside after dark. Nor do my wife's parents. It was about 9:15 p.m. and getting dark fairly fast. My wife and I were sitting by the fire behind the cottage, facing the woods. The forest behind the cottage stretches for many miles. My wife decided to go to bed, and after she went inside, I sat quietly, staring at the fire, when I heard what sounded like 3 whacks in the distance behind the cottage. I couldn't gauge the distance, but I guessed it might have been between half a kilometer to a kilometer straight back, based on the trailing echo. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. Another 10 to 15 minutes went by, then I heard it again. Same 3 whacks, but closer, louder, with less echo. I thought maybe a moose was hitting its antlers against a tree, but that time of year, they don't have antlers. Besides, the 3 consistent whacks seemed too well timed and way too loud. I sat there trying to figure it out. Another 15 minutes later, I heard the same 3 whacks, this time really close, maybe within a few hundred feet. I immediately stood up. It made no sense. The bush is thick back there, and by now it was pitch black. No lights. I stood there with only a pen-sized LED flashlight. I considered getting the axe from the garage, but I didn't want to leave the cottage. I quietly walked along the deck to the front of the cottage, stopped to listen, then went back toward the back. As I stood there listening, the 3 whacks came again, this time probably less than 100 feet away, right at the tree line behind the fire pit. I immediately ran to the front of the cottage, went in, and locked the door. I went to the back bedroom and peeked out at the fire pit. I expected to see someone, or something, but there was nothing. I didn't hear anything else. It took me hours to fall asleep. My heart was racing. A few years later, something else happened, but I wasn't alone this time. At least 10 of us were out there when we heard a blood-curdling scream from a few hundred yards away. Everyone stopped talking and looked at each other. Soon after, the same type of scream came from deep in the forest, as if answering the first one. I scoured the internet and listened to all kinds of animal sounds and screams. Nothing comes close. Was it Bigfoot? We've never seen anything resembling one, but I believe that's what we have around us. I was driving home on an isolated road through a mountainous area in Tilda County, Pennsylvania. It was late, and I was exhausted. I was in and out of a daydream state. You know how it is when you're tired and pushing on. The caffeine wasn't helping, and I was too cheap to get a hotel. Then, as I approached a curve, my headlights lit up something that looked like a person, but almost double or triple in size. I swerved to avoid it and woke up immediately. I wasn't sure if I clipped it, but my car slid into a ditch. I got out to check if I'd hit someone, but there was no one. I was certain I saw something. The car was stuck. I sat in it, thinking I saw movement. Then the driver's side window was suddenly blocked by the drenched, furry body of something large, on 2 legs, but definitely not human. It peered in the window, ugly, evil-looking, long wolf-like snout, yellow fangs, and eyes that glowed unnaturally. It scratched the window with a long claw, grinning, as if it knew I couldn't run. Then another one appeared, and another. I don't know how many. I was frozen in fear. Then, in an instant, they were gone. I didn't understand why, until a pickup truck pulled up behind me. An old man stepped out, asked if I was okay, and pulled me out of the ditch. I told him what I saw. He got a strange look like he'd heard it before, but wouldn't say more. That was in November 2020. I'll never forget it. I can only imagine what may have happened to me if that old man had not come to my rescue. This was back in '66 or '67, not sure. I was between 17 and 18 years old. Me and 3 friends stayed the night out in the desert of Adelanto, California. One of them lived in a trailer in the middle of nowhere, which was fine because we were partying. Something happened during the kickback, and I got mad, stormed off outside, and walked for a good 5 minutes. All of a sudden, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was confused by this unintentional reaction to God only knows what. I stopped walking. All wildlife stopped with me. No more crickets, no owls, dead silence. I looked straight ahead to my left and saw a figure about 6 feet or more moving between 2 large cacti. I immediately booked it. I ran as fast as I could, knowing something was chasing me. I ran inside the trailer and slammed the door, screaming bloody murder, frantically trying to tell my friends what had just happened. They all started laughing, thinking I was nuts. But then, out of nowhere, you could hear a scrape running alongside the trailer, like claws on metal. Everyone froze, and we spent the rest of the night guarding all doors and windows. After that night, it was never spoken of again. Has anyone experienced anything like this? My father worked at NASA's Johnson Space Center. As a teenager growing up in the suburbs of Houston, Texas, I was also able to make my way into the great outdoors. I was a Boy Scout, and we would take numerous camping trips throughout Texas, the hill country, and the piney woods. My mother's parents owned a ranch in northeast Texas, and it was a frequent family destination for holidays and sometimes just for a vacation. I learned how to fish, hunt, pitch a tent, and basic survival skills at an early age. I would often take treks into the woods by myself without a care in the world. Thinking back on certain events that happened back then, I now view them differently, mostly because of what I'm about to tell you. It was a later experience in the Ozark National Forest at night, and it has profoundly changed the way I look at life. I moved to Northwest Arkansas in 2005. My brother and mother had already moved to Ria's Mill, Arkansas. I would frequently fish at Lake Lincoln. I would often park my truck a short walking distance from the dam and then walk up and fish from the dam bank. During one visit, I began to work my way off the dam and into some thick brush and trees to get to a large boulder protruding over the lake's bank. As I approached the tree line, I began to have an eerie feeling. It came over me out of nowhere. Now, I've been in the woods alone many times before and never felt this sensation. I quickly grabbed my rod and reel, along with my tackle box, and made it back to my truck. I have not been back to Lake Lincoln since. A year later, around 2007, I had moved about 40 minutes from my mother's place. I had just gone into business for myself. I was single and lived alone. I would often get bored and take drives through the mountains, sometimes even at night. One late night, I decided I needed to get out for a long ride. I was going to head to my mother's place. I started down the freeway and then exited onto Highway 16. I continued down Highway 16 for about 20 miles, then turned left onto County Road 33. It was another 10 miles or so before turning off to get to my mother's home. I crossed the Illinois River Bridge and made a sharp curve to the left. It went up a steep hill and then entered the Ozark National Forest. It was dark, only my headlights lighting the way. At the time, there was no cell service. I was smack dab in the middle of nowhere. I reached Wellington late. As I began to climb the next hill, I remembered a small pull-off lookout to my left. I needed to relieve myself. I pulled my truck over, crossed the oncoming lane, and parked on the lookout shoulder. I left the motor running with the headlights on. I stepped out, leaving the truck door open, and began to relieve myself. To the right of me was somewhat of a cliff. I could see a small pond on the opposite side of the lake, which was to my left. I found myself fixated on that ridgetop. Then I had this overwhelming feeling come over me. The hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up, and goosebumps ran down my arms. There was a strong sense that someone or something was watching me. I was standing outside a lit-up truck in the middle of nowhere. I was a sitting duck. I quickly finished, jumped into my truck, threw it into drive, and squealed my wheels up the hill. Some years later, I married and became a father. My family and I went hiking through the same lake area, but on the other side. There was a rock-covered enclosure that Parks and Recreation had built some years back. While there, those same eerie feelings came back. Something wasn't right. I kept it to myself, and we finished our day of fun. A short time later, I found myself researching Bigfoot sightings in Arkansas. A significant sighting had been documented in that same area just prior to my roadside event. I also read of a sighting of a red-headed Bigfoot digging in the sand underneath a bridge along the Illinois River. I found out the sightings had been documented all over this area, dating back many years. Then I began to think of my childhood, and things began to add up. Like the time my grandmother told my brother and me not to venture back into certain parts of the wooded area. Or the times Grandpa's bird dogs would go into a barking frenzy in the middle of the night, and he would step outside, shooting a shotgun into the air. I can't venture into the woods much anymore, certainly not alone, and certainly not at night. I'm a Bigfoot believer. I truly feel that my overwhelming strange feelings were the result of a Bigfoot either watching me or being in the area. As a park ranger, I've always loved exploring the wilderness, and I've seen some strange things over the years. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found deep in the heart of the park. It was a hot summer day, and I was on patrol, making my way through a dense thicket of trees when I stumbled upon a small town. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. At first, I thought I had stumbled upon some sort of movie set. The buildings were small and rustic, made of weathered wood, and surrounded by gardens filled with herbs and vegetables. The people who lived there were Native Americans, and they all seemed busy with their daily tasks. They stopped and looked at me as if they were surprised to see me. As I approached, I was greeted by a man who introduced himself as the leader of the community. He explained that they had been living there for generations, in harmony with nature and each other. They had no interest in the outside world and preferred to keep to themselves. I was fascinated by their way of life and spent the next few hours talking to the locals and learning about their customs and traditions. But as the sun began to set, they started to warn me about something I had never heard of before: the Wendigo. They told me the Wendigo was a dangerous creature that roamed the deep woods, preying on anyone foolish enough to venture into its territory. They warned me to stay away from the woods at night and always be on the lookout for any signs of the creature. I didn't believe them, of course. I'd seen my fair share of dangerous animals in the park, but I had never heard of anything like the Wendigo. I thanked them for their hospitality and went on my way, convinced they were just trying to scare me. As I made my way back to the ranger station, the sun had already set, and the woods were shrouded in darkness. I heard strange noises coming from the trees, and I could feel a sense of unease creeping up on me. It was as if the forest itself was alive and watching me. And then, out of nowhere, I saw it. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall and emaciated, with long, bony limbs and piercing red eyes. It stood there watching me before disappearing into the woods. I was terrified. I had never felt so alone and vulnerable in my life. I tried to run, but I quickly realized I was hopelessly lost. The woods seemed to stretch in all directions, and I had no idea which way to go. As the night wore on, the creature continued to haunt me, appearing and disappearing, as if toying with me. I was cold, hungry, and scared out of my mind. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The sun began to rise, and the creature was gone. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, I was a mess. I had never been so scared in my life, and I knew I had come dangerously close to becoming the Wendigo's next victim. I tried to tell my colleagues what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was just tired and imagining things. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I would never forget the terror I experienced in those woods. From that day on, I made sure to listen to the warnings of the locals and always be on the lookout for any signs of danger, because in the deep woods of the park, you never know what might be lurking just beyond the trees. This was my boyfriend's experience, not my own. He grew up in Mesa, Arizona. Really early in the morning, when he was pretty young, He woke up and couldn't fall back asleep. He looked out the window of his bedroom, and there was a man-wolf crouched down on the driveway, facing the window. He described it like a man with a wolf skin or head on top of him. He went back to bed, still couldn't sleep, so he looked again, and the creature was standing right there, with glowing eyes, peering into the window. He freaked out, crawled back into bed, and just tried to fall asleep. Could have been a dream. Thanks for listening, cowboys and cowgirls. Hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we dive deep into the horror of the American countryside. See you then.
Can you tell me what time you are listening to this video? How do you feel about my video? If you like, please like and subscribe, and comment to let me know. That is a great motivation for me. Thank you, guys.
I've been a fire lookout for about a year now. I spend most of my life alone in a small, window-lined, one-room shack atop a steel and wood-frame tower in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. My only companions are my collection of cheap novels, a laptop computer with infrequent and unreliable internet service, and the two-way radio I use to communicate with the few nearby towers and ranger stations. Nearby is a bit of a misnomer, though. Using my high-powered binoculars, I can just barely make out Tower 12 on a clear day, situated several miles to my west. Tower 15, the next nearest to my location, only appears as a glint of sunlight to my east when the sun catches it just right. I've been told the Parks Department intends to put up some additional towers in this area as soon as it gets the necessary funding, which is probably no time soon. That's fine with me, though. I like the solitude. It helps quiet my mind, keeps the memories at bay. Mostly, I occupy my days either with simple maintenance in and around the tower or scanning the dense trees all around me for any signs of trouble. It's been a dry year, so the threat of fire is a constant one. This particular afternoon, I was clearing some brush from around the base of the tower that had begun to encroach on the fire road leading back to the nearby ranger station 20 miles away. Even with the heavy suspension of the government-issued Jeep, the road was a harsh ride at the best of times. I had just finished dragging some brush cuttings off into the tree line when the radio clipped to my belt squawked. Tower 9. This is Tower 12. Do you copy? It was Billy Johnson, my supervisor. Nice enough guy, I suppose. Tended to leave me alone most of the time. I straightened up and stretched my back, wiping the sweat from my eyes with my forearm and keyed the microphone attached to my shoulder. Go for Tower 9, I replied as I replaced the shears and bow saw into the small storage shed near the base of the stairs. John, do you have eyes on a bit of smoke north of your position? Stand by, Billy, I said, snatching up my water bottle and jogging to the metal staircase that wound its way around the tower. I didn't bother locking the 8-foot chain-link fence surrounding my little compound. Chances were, I'd be back soon enough. Reaching the top, I stepped through the trapdoor and onto the walkway that circled the cabin, closing it behind me. It was habit at this point. The last thing I needed was to take an errant step and tumble down through the open hatch. I'd probably end up breaking my neck. As I passed by, I reached into the open door of the shack and grabbed the binoculars hanging on a nearby hook. Rounding the railed corner of the walkway and turning my attention to the dark green blanket of trees stretching out before me, I saw the smoke almost instantly. A thin trickle of wispy white haze rose lazily above the canopy some distance off. Probably just some campers, I figured, though there weren't any approved campsites in that area. We always had more than a few folks each season who decided that camping off-trail in the deep bush sounded like quite a hoot. Most of them come back just fine, oblivious to the danger that this wilderness presents to anyone not adequately prepared. Some of them have to be brought out by search and rescue. Some of them just don't come back. A ranger or a random hiker might occasionally come across the deserted remains of a campsite and report it in. Those are the spooky ones, the ones where people just vanished and left behind a perfectly set-up campsite. No explanation, no clues, just a deserted clearing, often with perfectly intact tents and personal effects. But there are bears and mountain lions, along with a handful of lesser predators that roam these forests, and sometimes they get hungry enough to stalk and even kill humans. And that doesn't even take into consideration the much more likely scenario: folks stepping out of their tents at night to take a piss and very quickly getting lost. Most humans aren't suited to survival in the wilderness, unfortunately. My radio squawked again. Tower 9, what's the word? Yeah, I see it, Billy. Looks to be a couple of miles due north of my tower. What's your plan? He asked. I knew what he meant. Keep an eye on it and hope for the best, or take a trip over and investigate. After a brief pause, I sighed with resignation. It's probably just a campfire, but I guess I better head over and take a look to be sure. I didn't relish the thought of trekking to that area of wilderness, to be honest. It was the only area I hadn't explored during my time here. There weren't many trails heading in that direction, and the ones that did were badly overgrown and too narrow for the Jeep. A couple of miles hike might not seem like a lot, but when you're out here alone, the dense trees seem to stretch on forever. 2 miles can feel like 100. Roger that, John, Billy replied. Take your pack and your rifle. Check in periodically. Will do. Tower 9 out, I said, replacing the binoculars on their hook and shouldering the red canvas backpack waiting dutifully in the corner chair. I grabbed the rifle from its rack over the doorframe, checked to make sure it was loaded, and headed out. As I locked the gate behind me, I threw my pack in the back of the Jeep and set the rifle beside it. The Jeep wouldn't get me too far before the brush made the trail impassable, but if it saved me even half a mile of hiking, it was well worth it. The sun was still high in the sky. I had plenty of time to get there and back before dusk, as long as I didn't dawdle. I started the engine and turned the wheels toward the unmaintained trail to my right. After only a few moments, the trees and canopy obscured any trace of the watchtower behind me. I was actually able to push the Jeep farther than expected, a pleasant surprise. I was probably a mile along the trail before it bent, and a massive pine lay across the path, much too large to go over. The dense underbrush around me ruled out the possibility of going around. I immediately lamented not bringing the chainsaw. Cutting it up and winching the pieces out of the way wouldn't have been too difficult and would have saved me a ton of trouble. With a quiet curse, I stepped out of the Jeep and grabbed my gear from the back seat. I smiled to myself as a quote from a certain fictional adventure-seeking archaeologist suddenly came to mind. We walk from here. Making sure to mark the location of the Jeep on my handheld GPS, I stepped over the thigh-high tree trunk and continued along the path. According to my earlier estimate, the trail was heading in the direction of the smoke, which was a blessing in my book. The less time I had to spend bushwhacking, the better. The trail continued to narrow, as I expected, and before long, I was brushing branches and leaves with my shoulders as I walked. The trees, which had been alive with the cheering and chirping of animal life near the tower, now seemed muted. The forest around me was growing denser, feeling oddly claustrophobic at times. Billy checked in a few times, and I updated him on my progress, promising to maintain regular contact. He advised me that a weather relay from the ranger station had reported an approaching storm, likely to reach us before nightfall. A quick glance at my watch made me wince. I had already spent more time than I'd predicted. Maybe it was best to turn around and head back. The last thing I wanted was to get caught out here overnight with minimal supplies and a rainstorm. I wasn't worried, but it sure wouldn't be comfortable. If I'd been farther from my destination, I probably would have turned back right then. I wish I had. Within another 20 minutes, however, I smelled the faint scent of a wood fire. Not strong, but definitely there. I was even more certain of what I'd find when I reached them. When I stepped out of the now almost non-existent trail, I found myself in a sparsely treed area amidst a dozen or so wooden shacks, and I halted in surprise. I had reached the base of a hilly rise covered in heavy forest, and these old, forgotten cabins looked like they had belonged to some sort of small settlement. Perhaps an old logging camp, I thought. I didn't know this place even existed, and made a mental note to research it when I got back to my tower. I keyed the microphone. Tower 12, this is John. Do you copy? Billy replied, his voice staticky and distant. Hey, John, Tower 12, what's your status? I frowned and looked around at the towering trees all around me. I suppose I was asking more out of the portable radio than was reasonable. I was lucky I still had any signal at all. I found what looks like an old logging or trapping camp, I said, meandering among the decaying and derelict cabins. Most had collapsed roofs and were barely standing. The campfire has to be nearby. I'm going to take a look around a bit more. There was a pause before Billy spoke again. What's your current location, John? I glanced at my handheld GPS and relayed my position. Another pause. John, I think you should probably just turn back. Come back, okay? You don't have many more hours of daylight left, and that storm looks like it's getting worse. Something in his voice sounded off, but I couldn't quite place it. Nervous, maybe? I couldn't blame him. My safety was his responsibility, and the idea of one of his lookouts being caught out in a storm overnight probably didn't sit well. Coincidentally, it didn't sit well with me either. You may be right, Billy, I replied, turning around and casting my eyes over the area. I'll just head. I stopped as my eyes caught sight of a bright yellow nylon tent just beyond the last of the structures. Repeat your last, John. I didn't get that. Stand by. Tower 12, I said absently, making my way toward what I now realized was a small cluster of 3 modern tents situated around a central fire ring. The fire had been completely extinguished, but the embers still smoldered lowly, the source of the smoke. I looked around for the campers. Nothing. No one in sight or earshot. Sleeping bags and electric lanterns were still inside the tents, though I couldn't find any backpacks or supplies. Hello? I called out, turning in a circle. I'm with the Forest Service. Is anyone here? Nothing. Just the muted echo of my own voice. I was about to dump some dirt on the remaining embers of the campfire and call it a day when I noticed the narrow footpath leading toward the slope. In the soft dirt were clearly recent footprints heading away from the camp. I keyed the mic again. Tower 12, this is John. I found the source of the smoke. It's a campfire, all right? Nothing to be concerned about, Billy answered almost immediately. Roger that, John. Head back home. I paused a moment, curiosity pulling me toward the footpath. I'll be heading back shortly, Billy. Just want to check something out first. I wouldn't screw around out there, John, Billy replied, an edge to his voice. Better head back now so you can beat the storm. His last sentence didn't exactly sound like a suggestion. Something had him rattled. I hesitated before answering. Acknowledged, I said, knowing full well I was going to check out the path before heading back. Still, I didn't feel like arguing with my supervisor over something so small. Just a quick walk up that path, then I'd be on my way. This path was even less established than the one I'd been on earlier, but I could clearly see the campers' imprints in the dirt as I went. Before long, I emerged into a small clearing, eyes widening with yet another unexpected discovery. The rough-hewn timber that framed the entryway was set into the near vertical slope of the hillside before me. It created a dark tunnel entrance that had clearly been sealed off with a heavy iron gate many years ago, likely by the Park Service to keep inquisitive hikers from falling to their deaths in an old, abandoned mine shaft. So it had been a mining camp, not a logging one. I didn't know there were any mines near here. Hell, I wasn't even sure what they could have been mining for. Coal? Maybe gold? Did they even have gold mines in Tennessee? Who knows? Certainly not me. Clearly, regardless, now that gate stood wide on its hinges, the remains of a rusted chain and antique padlock lying in the dirt nearby. Hell, I couldn't just turn around and leave. One of these dumbass campers had decided it'd be fun to explore a closed and restricted mine entrance. This is Tower 12. This is John D. Reed. Billy probably wouldn't be happy that I'd continued my exploration after he told me to head back, but there was nothing to do about it now. I wasn't equipped or trained for any sort of cave exploration or rescue. The Rangers had very specialized teams for that sort of thing. But I could at least poke my head inside and see if there were any campers, or hear them, confirm if they went inside. No answer from the radio. I tried again, with the same results. I tried a different approach. Tower 15, this is John from Tower 12. Do you copy? I said into the radio. I figured I might be able to at least get Nathan's attention if I was out of range of Billy. Tower 12. There was a burst of static that sounded like it might have contained the hint of a human voice, but it was too distorted and distant to make anything out. There was only a moment of indecision before I made up my mind. I knew it was reckless going into the mine, especially when my supervisor believed I was currently on my way back to the tower. But I had this nagging intuition that something might be wrong with the whole situation. Maybe someone was hurt and needed help. I couldn't just leave them there, knowing that I might be their only chance of rescue. In retrospect, I should have turned back and called it in to the ranger station. They could have mobilized the search and rescue teams that specialized in cave rescues. I should have. But I didn't. I pulled my powerful LED flashlight from my pack, turned it on, and headed into the pitch-black darkness of the mine entrance. The walls and floor had been smoothly carved many years ago, which made my footing uneventful, and the tunnel itself was mostly a straight shot. Several times during the first few minutes, I turned back to watch the bright square of daylight at the entrance gradually shrink to a pinpoint of light. By the time I'd taken the first dogleg turn of the tunnel, I was in complete darkness. It was a very strange feeling, oppressive almost. At one point, I turned off my flashlight experimentally, but after only a few seconds, I quickly flicked it back on. In that short time, my heart had been pounding in my chest, and some primal fear had begun growing inside me. It took a moment to calm myself. The darkness was absolute. It was almost as if you could feel it pressing in on you. My footsteps seemed much louder than they should have on the dirt floor, and the air was growing cold and damp the further I went. After another 100 feet or so, the smoothly carved tunnel ended abruptly in a wall of rubble. I couldn't tell if it was a cave-in at some point, or if this was simply where the miners stopped digging and hadn't bothered to remove the debris. But either way, it certainly appeared to be the end of the line. And then I saw it. I almost missed it because of the way the light and shadows played over the head-sized rocks strewn before me. But when I looked closer, I realized I was looking at a ragged hole in the wall. It was only 5 feet across or so, and definitely didn't look like the deliberate formation of the tunnel I was standing in now. It almost looked like the miners had broken into a natural void of some sort. Interesting. But there was no way in hell I was going in there. I was definitely not trained or outfitted for any sort of spelunking trip, and it didn't seem the sort of thing suited to the learn-as-you-go method. Just as I was turning back to make my way out of the mine, I heard the distant sound of voices echoing from the opening in the stone wall. The sound was faint, and may have just been my imagination, but I didn't think so. "Hello?" I called, pressing my face into the black abyss of the hole. "Can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." Nothing. The air from beyond the breach was cold and smelled stale. Old. Wrong. It felt as if I didn't belong here. None of us did. There was a long moment of unbroken silence, and then I heard a voice again. Closer this time. "Did you hear that?" it said, presumably to a companion. It sounded like a young woman, nervous, uncertain. "Hello? Someone there?" That settled it for me. I carefully crawled through the opening into the space beyond. Shining my light around, I found myself in a small natural chamber, maybe 30 feet across, with an uneven ceiling of jagged rock that barely cleared my head. The first thing that caught my attention was the cracked lantern lying on the ground. It looked old. Very old. Maybe 100 years or more. A thick layer of grime and age covered its soot-blackened surface, and the glass was thick and uneven. Beside the askew lantern was a small leather-bound book, partially buried in the dirt and dust, with a moldering leather strap securing it closed. It looked like a journal. And without a thought, I tucked it into my backpack. Raising my light back up, scanning around the room. "Hello?" I called again. I didn't hear the voices anymore, but the narrow beam of my flashlight illuminated another tunnel in the far corner of this room, mired in darkness. Can you hear me? Once again, I got that feeling that something wasn't right. Then the voice came again. Closer this time. Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here? She asked, her voice trembling with apprehension. I hesitated, frowning. Something didn't seem right about the voice, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Before I could summon my words to respond, another voice called out. This time, it was clear. The voice of a young man. We can hear you moving around in there. Please help us. We're lost, and our friend is hurt. Hear me moving around in there? I was shouting to them. I sure as hell wasn't trying to hide. Could they not hear me for some reason? I stepped forward to the secondary tunnel and raised my voice again. I'm with the Forest Service. It was then, when I reached out to steady myself against the wall of the tunnel entrance, that my hand met something wet, and I recoiled in disgust, thinking I had just grabbed a handful of some subterranean slime. When I shone my light on it, however, it became very clear the reality was far worse. Blood. I stepped back, trying to keep the panic that was fighting to take control of my rationality at bay. I needed to keep a level head, for now. Panning my light around, I saw an astonishing amount of blood painting the wall and floor in front of me. Somebody had definitely been hurt, and badly. With blood loss like this, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stabilize them long enough to get rescue in here. What the hell happened here? And why did the hikers continue into the cave after one of them was injured this badly? Unless they lost their light and got turned around, there was no way for them to get lost. There hadn't been any branches to this tunnel since I first entered. All they had to do was turn around and walk until they saw daylight. The man's voice called again, colored with the unmistakable tinge of fear. What the hell is that? Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand. He seemed to be getting closer. At least if I could guide them to my voice, maybe I could get them out of here. Get to higher ground. Radio for rescue evac. They had a helicopter permanently stationed at the main ranger station. It could be here in 20 minutes if I was able to reach them. The woman's voice came again, and this time I froze. Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here? All at once, it hit me. The indescribable unease I had been mostly successful in repressing now fought back with renewed vigor. I realized in that moment what I had missed previously. The woman had repeated herself, twice now. No change in her inflection, no variation in emotion or urgency. It was exactly the same, down to the syllable. It was like I was listening to a recording. Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here? Repeated the male voice, now even closer. Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand. Below the words, I could hear the stealthy sliding of something over rocks. It seemed like it wasn't too far beyond the tunnel entrance now, but I wasn't going to wait for it to emerge from the darkness. I didn't think that what I'd see emerge from the darkness would be a couple of college kids who'd had a rough time of it during a weekend camping trip. Allowing my panic to run free, I turned and threw myself through the cave breach and landed roughly on the flat stone floor of the mine shaft. Beyond skinning my hands to hell and banging my knee on a rock, scrambling my feet with a hiss of pain, I ran as fast as I could, not realizing until I finally burst into the waning light of the late afternoon that I had lost my rifle somewhere in that cave. It was darker than it was when I first entered the mine, and a quick glance to the sky showed the angry black thunderheads that had moved in, as promised, much faster than I had expected. I quickly swung the iron gate closed on screeching hinges and looped the chain between the bars as tightly as I could, securing it rather lamely with the hasp of a broken padlock. I stood there for a long moment, bent over with my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath outside the mine entrance when I felt the first drops of the coming storm on the back of my neck. I straightened and looked through the bars of the gate into the ominous darkness beyond, realizing how ridiculous my barricade really was. It wouldn't do much good if something tried to get out, but at least it made me feel a little bit better. At least it made me feel a little bit better until I heard the voice echoing from the mine shaft. Peh, getting closer. It was unmistakable. Uncanny. Hello, can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you. By the time dawn arrived the next morning, I had climbed down from my temporary shelter in the low boughs of the red cedar and tried to work out all the painful kinks from my stiff shoulders and neck. The night had not been kind to me, but I was alive, which is more than my fiercest mind expected after yesterday. The night had been harrowing. There was no better word to describe it. The rain hissed among the trees and stung exposed skin angrily, driven by the banshee wail of the wind rushing through the forest, accentuated by the chaotic flashing of lightning and the heart-stopping crack of thunder. Because of this relentless chaos, it's difficult to say with any certainty. But throughout the night, I thought I heard something large trying to move stealthily in the forest near my shelter. I say, trying, because it felt like whatever stalked through the underbrush was more at home in the unnatural, Stygian gloom of a cave than under the watchful eyes of nature. Of course, it could just as easily have been my imagination. In the first dim light of dawn, as it started to illuminate the sodden and dripping forest, I spent the better part of 20 minutes straining my eyes with every ounce of concentration as I scanned the gray woodlands around me. I was only 10 feet or so above the ground, but there was no way I was going to step foot from my hide until I was absolutely certain that I was alone. Once I was satisfied, I was alone for the moment. I climbed down to the muddy ground. I tried the radio several times through the night and into the morning, but wasn't able to get even a burst of static that might indicate someone trying to respond. A combination of the storm and interference from the trees worked against me. My first thought was to get back to my Jeep as quickly as possible and run every drop of gas out of its tank, trying to get as far away from this place as I could. When I checked the GPS to see how close I was to its marked position, however, I found the unit unresponsive, with a disastrous crack across the screen that seemed to mock my dismay, probably caused by my less than graceful scramble from that damned cave. A rifle, no radio, no GPS. Perfect. I still had a compass and the rising sun to guide me, though, and that was something. I was only a couple miles from my tower, which should have been somewhere due south of where I stood. I knew that once I got close, I should be able to either find the service road or the tower itself, so there wasn't much danger of getting myself lost, at least. It was a small comfort, but one I gladly took. I moved through the trees and undergrowth with more speed and recklessness than I probably should have. An ankle broken by an errant misstep would have been bad news. Still, even though I hadn't heard or seen anything of my late-night visitor, I couldn't help but feel I was being watched. Do you know that creeping sense of dread you feel when you've just turned off the lights in the basement and now have to climb the stairs back to the light of the doorway? Or when you're making your way from your car in a dark and lonely parking lot? The feeling that something is there, something much more suited to the dark than you are? It's that same feeling that pushed my footsteps almost to a jog as I traversed the uneven ground and storm-felled trees that tried to hinder my passage. For the next hour, I moved at this pace, aware of every rasping lungful of breath, knowing that I should pause and rest for a few minutes, as pushing myself to fatigue would only increase my chances of falling or hurting myself. I imagined myself lying in blinding pain next to an unseen chuck hole, clutching at a broken leg and watching as the sunlight began to dim with the onset of dusk, waiting for whatever hunted my trail to find me. What would happen? Would I even have time to look on its visage before it struck? Did those campers in the cave? A misstep and a stumble that nearly made this nightmare a self-fulfilled prophecy jarred me back to the present. Against all instinct, I forced my pace to slow, first to a trot, then to a walk, and then reluctantly, I stopped completely, trying to catch my breath while I scanned the dense woodland around me. Nothing. No. Not nothing. As my heart began to slow and my breathing returned to a more manageable cadence, I turned my gaze back in the direction I had been headed, and an unconscious smile found its way to my lips. The sun had risen high in the morning sky during my flight, and now I caught a flash of its reflection on the windows of my tower, not 200 yards directly ahead of me. I laughed aloud with relief, fully aware that this fear-tinted eruption was closer to the manic cackle of lunacy than anything else. I didn't care, though. My feet started forward on their own, quickly reaching a brisk pace. A few minutes later, I burst out of the trees into the maintained clearing surrounding my tower, feeling the full sunlight on my face for the first time since yesterday. Had it only been a day? It seemed like longer. I was so filled with relief that I didn't even register the fact that the forestry department Jeep sat parked near my fenced-in tower until I started entering the combination into the gate lock. The faded white 12 emblazoned on the corner of the windshield told me that it was Billy's Jeep, which wasn't much of a surprise. I realized after a moment, after not hearing back from him, that I was more surprised I hadn't returned to find an entire search and rescue team making preparations to search for their lost puppy. I punched the 4-digit code into the mechanical combination lock on the gate and stepped through, making sure to close and lock it behind me. I stood there for a moment, staring through the tall chain-link fence at the dense tree line, wondering if something waited just out of sight in the shadows, staring back at me with hungry anticipation. I shook off the sudden chill as best as I could and made my way quickly to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Billy was going to be pissed at me, I was sure, but that thought was a fleeting one that didn't take purchase. His displeasure was the least of my concerns right now. When I reached the top, I threw open the trapdoor and suddenly found myself looking down the muzzle of a very large rifle. Even in that brief moment of abrupt shock, I could register how the barrel trembled in the hands of its agitated master, and I wondered how close I came to having my life ended in a brief flash of light. The moment only lasted a second or two, and then Billy hastily swung the rifle away in a safe direction. "Damn it, John," he exclaimed, his tone an incongruous mixture of relief and fear. "I almost shot you." I stepped fully through the trap door and let it close behind me. "Jesus, Billy," I breathed, leaning back against the railing. I suddenly felt weary and realized it was likely the adrenaline now rushing through my system that had kept me moving at such a hurried pace throughout the morning. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, stepping back inside my shack and taking a chair at the small table in the center of the room. I noted with mild interest that he kept the rifle leaning against the table beside him instead of stowing it in the rack over the door, but decided not to comment on it. Billy Johnson was in his middle years, maybe 45 or so, with a bit of a gut and grayish-brown hair, trimmed clothes. He wore an impressive mustache that reminded me of something an Old West gunslinger might sport. He was dressed in typical attire, khaki Forest Service shirt and brown cargo pants. In addition to the rifle, I had had the unfortunate opportunity to closely examine a moment earlier. I noticed that he wore his .500 Magnum in a holster at his side. That wasn't too unusual. When in the bush, bears and mountain lions can sneak up on you unawares. Having a hand cannon within easy reach goes a long way toward taking the fight out of them if necessary. It was a little unusual for a drive over to another tower, I suppose, but not exceptionally so, given the circumstances. I took the opposite chair, dropping my pack to the floor next to me. I realized my legs were still shaking anxiously and placed my hands on my knees to try to calm them. He was trying to deflect, but he was horrendously bad at it. He knew something. I was sure of it. "You know where I've been," I replied, gambling on instinct. I watched his face closely for a reaction and wasn't disappointed when he winced and turned his focus out the window and over the forest to the north. "I told you to abort and head back to your tower," he stated brusquely. "But you just had to feed that curiosity of yours, didn't you? You're damn lucky to be alive, you know that?" From my chair, I reached under the cupboard to my right and pulled a half-empty bottle of Jameson and a couple of mostly clean glasses. Billy turned his head and raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Alcohol was a no-no up here, but when I poured and handed him one of the glasses, he accepted it without a word. I took a pull from the other. "It's my own damn fault, I suppose," he continued, turning back fully to me. "It's been so long since anyone's even thought of Camp LeClaire that it didn't even click for me when you told me where you saw the campfire." I took another drink and then poured a bit more of the whiskey. "Camp LeClaire," I repeated. "That old mining camp?" "Logging camp, actually," he corrected me. "The mine was there long before the East Atlantic Logging Company set up out there. Nobody knows who dug it. Hell, nobody even knows when it was dug, a long time before the 19th century at least. Camp LeClaire was established in 1872, and the mine was old even before that." He looked at me in earnest for the first time since I'd returned and frowned. "You look like hell, John. Got caught in the storm, I'm guessing. Hell of a storm." I only raised my eyebrows as if to say, "What an understatement." Billy nodded knowingly and took another swallow. "Did you find the campers at least?" I shook my head and turned to look out the window to the north, where I could almost envision the black void of that mine entrance staring back at me. "No," I said softly. "I tracked them to the mine but lost them in the cave." I jumped when Billy's glass hit the floor, and he was out of his chair before I even realized it. Billy hadn't moved from his seat, but now both hands were splayed on the table before him as if to steady himself. His pale blue eyes were wide and fixed on me. "You went into the cave?" he said, a sudden and horrifying realization dawning on him. It was then I realized my mistake. He hadn't known. He thought I had just discovered the camp and the mine, and then got caught in the storm overnight. A close call, but nothing that couldn't be undone. "Yeah," I replied, nodding slowly, deliberately. "Yeah, I went into that cave looking for the campers. The gate had been cracked open already. I'm not sure by whom or when." I leaned forward in my chair and stared hard at him. "Billy, there's something in there. I think it got those campers. I think it followed me out." Billy Johnson's face had gone white then, and I thought for a moment he might pass out. He scooped his glass up from the floor with numb fingers and poured himself another splash of whiskey, downing it in one gulp. When he spoke again, it sounded far away and distant. "Utami," he muttered. "That's what the Chickasaw called it, and they were here long before we ever were. Blur is what the white man called it, among other names, Kuatami." He nodded. "False brother, lying man, something like that. Hell, I don't know. What do I look like, a translator?" "It means bad," he continued. "No matter what language you speak, it means something's out there that isn't supposed to be, something that was locked away a long time ago and forgotten." It was then that he stood and grabbed his rifle, as if suddenly remembering something. "I need to get back to my tower and make a call now." I gestured to the radio base station sitting patiently on the table near the door. "Why not use mine?" Billy shook his head. "Sorry, John. It doesn't work that way. Special phone, special number. I just hope I'm not too late." I started to stand. "I'll go with you," I said. He pointed a stern finger at me and narrowed his eyes. "No, you stay here, strap on your handgun, and make sure it's loaded." His voice was calm, almost cold, and didn't leave much room for debate. Still, I had no desire to stay alone with whatever this angler thing was roaming around out here. "Billy, I can go with you. I can help." I started to argue, but it was quickly cut off when he took a menacing step toward me. And I realized quickly how much I'd underestimated him because of his normally easy manner. "You will stay in your goddamn tower, and you will follow orders," he roared. I took an unconscious step back and reclaimed my seat, only managing a shaking nod in agreement. He took a trembling breath, pointed at the radio, and said in a slightly less terrifying tone, "And keep that thing on. As soon as I'm back at my tower, I'll radio you with updates." A moment later, he was gone, and the trapdoor slammed shut behind him. I stood and retrieved the Pelican case from under my cot. Inside was the same model of .500 Magnum revolver that Billy had been wearing, heavy and cold in my hands. I loaded it and belted it on the leather holster, feeling the reassuring weight tugging at my waist. "John?" I heard Billy call from below. I went outside to the walkway, leaning over the railing. He was standing beside his Jeep, 50 feet below, shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight as he looked up at me. "Make sure to keep everything locked. I'll come back for you," he shouted. I raised a hand to him and slid the latch shut on the trapdoor with my toe. I turned back into my shack as I heard Billy's Jeep fire up, and a moment later, it drove off down the rough service road toward his tower. I glanced back to the north, to the place where I had first seen the campfire smoke rising the day before, and suppressed a shudder. I was alone again, safe in my tower and armed, but alone. Abruptly, like an unexpected wave of nausea, the feeling that I was being watched washed over me with a chill, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked back over my shoulder to where Billy had been only a minute before, but saw only the rough service road and dense, impenetrable tree line beyond. That's probably just my imagination, but the feeling didn't diminish, and with every passing breath, I was more and more certain that there was something nearby, just out of sight, standing stone still in the gray-green foliage, waiting. I stood there a long moment, eyes straining for any hint of movement or alien shape among the shadows. But if there was, my human eyes weren't sharp enough to pick it out. I stepped back through the open doorway of my shack and dropped down into the chair again, my eyes catching the bottle of whiskey before me. I was tempted to pour another drink to help settle my nerves, but I could already feel the tickle of a buzz at the edges of my mind from what I'd already drunk, and quickly decided that was the last thing I needed for my reflexes and awareness to be dulled right now. I'd made more than one poor decision in the last 24 hours, and I didn't think adding another to the pile was such a great idea. Grabbing the bottle, I screwed the cap back on and reached to return it to the sparse cover to my right. As I did so, my boot caught my pack, knocking it over. Without a thought, I reached down to move it out of the way, and then remembered the old weather journal tucked inside the front pocket, the one I'd found in the cave. I reached into the unzipped front pocket. For a frustratingly alarming moment, my searching hand couldn't feel anything in the compartment, and I feared that I'd lost it in my chaotic escape. But then my fingers brushed the familiar shape, and I withdrew it, setting it in front of me on the table. I could see the book much more clearly now in the daylight. It wasn't overly large. A little larger than my hand, and maybe the thickness of my thumb. There were no markings on the front except for a simple, grimy brass loop that secured the leather strap holding it closed. I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was inside, but I needed some answers. Anything. A stray sound from the trees below rose to my ears, and I froze, listening intently for more, but none came. The forest around me was silent again, and I turned my attention back to the journal, pulling the strap free from the cover and turning to the front page. "From the pocket of Andrew Robinson," it said. The writing was neat and compact and distinctly male. The ink was a rich black, scrawled upon brittle yellow pages, and though faded with the years, was still mostly legible. I turned to the next page, where the entries began. I felt as though I had dropped into his account midway, as though this was just the latest in a series of journals that Andrew Robinson had been keeping. 23rd July, 1891. After nearly a week of hard overland trekking, we reached the abandoned camp late this afternoon, exactly where the old trapper said we would. Sequoia Arpani, tracker, has once again astonished me with his overland navigation skills. I must admit I was skeptical at the yar in the old tavern, spun the crowded confines of the common house in Dun Creek, especially after I smelled the liquor on his breath. But the professor never gathered a moment. The man's instincts for reading human character are absolutely singular. The camp looks to have been abandoned, and I have to admit a certain unease as we inspected the rough cabins. There isn't a soul to be found, and it looks years abandoned, yet everything stands as if awaiting the logger's return at any moment. Strange. 24th July, 1891. Our small troop both intrepid adventurers, made camp in the center of LeClaire last night. Those cabins likely would have been more comfortable, but I doubt any of us would have felt at ease intruding upon them. Richards laughed it off when someone mentioned how peculiar it was that the loggers had departed in such a hurry that they abandoned their personal possessions. But I could see in his eyes that he felt it odd as well. Sequoia, our ever-courageous and solid guide, seemed ill at ease and unusually withdrawn, refusing all conversation and only responding in queries with quiet grunts. Something of concern hides behind his eyes, though, and I wonder what it is. Only the professor seems unmoved by the unusually still atmosphere of this place, and his typical infectious positivity keeps working at our unease, keeping it from expanding beyond its current state. Today, we spent much of the day exploring the area surrounding Camp LeClaire, and the sunlight was nearly spent when Dobson burst back into camp with news of his discovery. We all of us raced at a moment's notice behind him as he led us along an ill-used and nearly invisible footpath that led ever ascending upon the side of the northern rocky slope. When the path terminated, we were deposited before a truly curious sight, a barricaded tunnel entrance that had been bored into the rock face by some unknown hands. I suspect some sort of exploration tunnel or added dug-in search of precious ores, especially given the nation's more recent history with gold fever. The wooden barrier that had been roughly assembled from a hodgepodge of heavy timber beams was curious, and several of our group commented on it. But the professor dismissed the triviality, so the matter was dropped. It is far too late in the day to proceed any further, but we plan to penetrate the barricade and enter the tunnel in the morning. The excitement among the men is palpable. 25th July 1891. Sequoia is gone. He took his supplies and his prized Winchester rifle and fled sometime during the night like a phantom. This is a shocking blow to all of us, foreign to the professor, with whom the Pawnee Tracker had partnered for a number of years across much of the eastern states. We have no explanation for his sudden desertion, and it sits unwell with the entirety of the group. The overall mood has darkened, I fear. Still, we must push onward. 25th July 1891 addendum. It took more than 2 hours of hard labor, but we were finally able to gain entrance to the mine shortly before noon today. Richards managed to get his boot caught between two heavy timbers as he stumbled forward, straining his ankle with a terrible cry. We feared it broken, but Dr. Franklin assured us that his bones seemed intact. Regardless, Richards was taken back to the camp, where he will convalesce while the rest of us make our entry. His part in our exploration has come to an end for now. We made our way in a single file through the added tunnel for some way before reaching its carved end. The light from our oil lanterns providing regrettably inadequate illumination over the rocky surroundings. When we reached the terminus of the mine tunnel, our hearts sank for a moment before the professor gave an exclamation of discovery and suddenly disappeared through a nearly hidden rift in the wall, surrounded by jagged rocks. We eagerly followed him through, careful of our footing as we went, and found ourselves in what I can only assume to be an accidental breach by the miners into a natural cave system. The air was chill and unmoving, but our excitement over this discovery laid any concerns or discomfort this may have caused. The professor directed us to set up a secondary camp in this new chamber, which we'll use as a staging point for further exploration. So, we spent the rest of the day bringing supplies for our main camp and constructing a smaller version in this moderately sized chamber. By the time we completed this endeavor, the efforts of the day precluded the start of the exploration until the group has had the opportunity to rest and replenish their energy. I feel I will sleep well tonight despite the anxious excitement buzzing around my mind. 26th July, 1891. Another shock. When we woke this morning, O'Connor is gone. The Irishman, who has ever been reliable and constant as the North Star, was assigned first watch last night. There is no trace of him, and no indication that he took any provisions or even his personal rucksack with him. I fear his natural inquisitiveness may have gotten the best of him and led him to explore the deeper caverns beyond our ad hoc base camp, for his lantern is the sole item that has gone missing with his person. The professor immediately rallied the rest of our small group, 7 in all now, and mounted a search for our lost companion. I tried to caution him against rushing into action, but he was not to be deterred. To my dismay, I was the sole man ordered to remain here at camp, whilst my companions took up their supplies and launched deeper into the cave system in the event young O'Connor returned in their absence. I was understandably disappointed, but grasped the logic of it well enough. I would loathe to think of O'Connor returning only to find us all gone, and then losing himself again, trying to find us. I shall endeavor to rest a bit. With luck, my companions will return before long with our lost compatriot. 27th July 1891. I am at my wit's end, and I'm unsure how to proceed. It has been more than a day since the professor led the rest of the men in search of poor O'Connor, and I have felt their absence as keenly as I am aware of my own solitude in this cave. I've seen nothing of our missing companion or the party that delved deeper into the system yesterday morning, and I know their lanterns did not have sufficient fuel to carry them for this long without other means of illumination to guide their return. I fear they are hopelessly lost. I myself had to return to Leclerc for more lantern oil for my waning light. I must admit, with no little embarrassment and some reluctance, to my return to this dark place, which no longer carries any of its former adventurous excitement or fascination. It is now nothing more than a doorway into the deep places below the earth, where men were never intended to tread. But the growing apprehension is not the worst of it. The sounds, by heaven's grace, the sounds. I first became aware of them last night as I did my lantern and tried to set myself to sleep. At first, it was only an indistinct and muted echo, which may have been interpreted as nothing more than the distant whistle of wind or other natural sound distorted by the unique acoustics of this place. Then I heard the distinct tonal qualities that could only be a man's voice. I instantly rose and took my lantern, raising the flame and rushing to the entrance of the cave that swallowed my companions. There I stood, listening with such keen focus that I felt beads of sweat upon my brow. I would swear upon a holy book that it was the distant call of the professor himself, and I eagerly called back with as much fervor as I could summon, hoping desperately to guide them back to me. However, the instant I called out, the voices vanished, and I was met only with the suffocating silence of an open tomb. There I stood, straight as a sentinel, praying for a response from my friends. After several minutes of absolute silence, my thoughts began turning to dark things. I became painfully aware that anything beyond the weak cast of my lantern would be utterly invisible to me. But I, on the other hand, would be lighted as a beacon to it. I pushed these thoughts from my mind as forcefully as I could, inwardly chastising myself for seeing ghouls where none existed. I was about to call out again to my lost companions when I heard it. The voice came again, echoing from the claustrophobic abyss that lay before me, mired in the blackest darkness one could imagine. It was still some distance away, I estimated, but I was certain it seemed closer now. When the third time I heard it, I was just barely able to make out the words, but it was enough to be sure. My own words echoed back at me from the depths of that damned cave, and in my own voice, I staggered and nearly dropped the lantern. At that moment, could the legends be true? The professor always seemed to believe them, though I must admit I attributed his faith to the unwavering certainty he held in those things lost to antiquity. He'd always maintained that a legend, especially one whispered by so many indigenous people without mutual contact, must have some root in truth. But that line of reasoning is antithetical to modern civility, and I must reject it and focus on the more probable explanation that my already stressed nerves were turning my fears against me. The voices must be those of my companions, lost in the dark, but near enough to hear their calls. They must be. I'm not certain what lies next, but I know that I cannot abandon my companions, my friends. to wander the darkness until they fall from exhaustion or dehydration, not while I might yet help them. I will leave this written account at the entrance to the cave. This lantern is nearly spent, but I have another with a full vessel that'll take its stead. If I do not return, at least someone may know of our passing here. May God be with us all. I closed the journal with a trembling hand, momentarily lost in what I just read. How is it possible? The journal was more than 130 years old. No animal alive then could be what pursued me now. What if it's not an animal? The sudden burst of static from Billy's call that simultaneously erupted from my radio base station and the portable handset clipped to my shoulder made me jump and drop the journal to the floor, heart pounding. I cursed under my breath and keyed the microphone. "Go for Tower 9, I answered, my voice tight as I spoke. My eyes drifted out across the sky to the east, where darkening thunderheads had been unknowingly gathering and marching slowly in my direction. I shook my head. Icing on the cake, I thought. "John, what's your position?" asked Billy, the self-assured authority that filled his tone now strangely absent, replaced with something else: fear. I frowned a moment at the question before answering. "What do you think, Billy? I'm in my tower, just like you told me." A strange pause before he spoke again. "John, this isn't some sort of joke, right? You're not outside my tower?" I was growing more agitated by the moment. What sort of question was that? I had no Jeep. There was no way I could have made it to his tower in such a short amount of time, even if I'd wanted to. "No, Billy," I answered with more force than I intended. "I'm not outside your tower." I stopped mid-sentence, a horrified realization sweeping over me. In that moment, I tried to speak, but my mouth had gone dry. "Billy," it was all I could muster. The radio was silent as my eyes slowly drifted to the west, where I could just make out the small, lonely shape of Tower 12. Barely visible over the darkening blanket of green. Was that a gunshot? Another night, another goddamn night stuck in this window-lined prism. At least I have a good view, so I guess that's something. The storm raged all night again last night, and only let up just before dawn. At one point, the winds were gusting hard enough to rock the tower, which was a bit disconcerting, to say the least. As I stand out on the wet catwalk around my shack, I see that the clouds haven't let us go just yet, and look every bit as pissed off as they did yesterday afternoon. It seems like the last dry season has come to an end, which is good since I've been slacking a bit on my fire-watching duties over the last couple of days. Gallows humor, right? Due to that, or I'm sitting in the corner in a fetal position crying. I've been told by my ex-fiancée that I'm not an attractive crier. I haven't heard Pete from Billy since his last terrifying broadcast to me yesterday. I tried to reach him several times since then, but no dice. I've also tried reaching Nathan and the ranger station, but all I get is static, even from my base radio set. When I first started here, I remember Billy telling me during my brief orientation that the radio should be able to reach out 50 miles or more, so I'm not sure what's going on with them. Update: I just took a quick look at the base station and found that the cable leading up to the antenna on the roof of the shack is now just a dangly thing swaying in the breeze. The storm must have decided it needed the antenna more than I did, because it's gone. I can see where the screws were torn out of the wooden mast, and before you say anything about whatever this thing is that's been stalking around and deciding to sabotage my radio, I should probably tell you that the wooden antenna mast looks like it's been around for a long time. The wood was probably dry rotted to begin with, and now that it's soaked, it's crumbled away into little wet brown bits as soon as I probed it with my fingers. Speaking of whatever this Kwatami or angler thing is, and I'm just going to call it a mimic, I think I haven't heard anything weird since yesterday. I'm assuming it's still over there somewhere, but I don't think it's nearby. If it's still anywhere around here, it's probably somewhere over near Tower 12, or at least that's what makes the most sense to me anyways. Which brings me to my shiny new lunatic idea. My Jeep. It can't be more than a mile down the northern track, still sitting there in front of that fallen pine. I could probably get to it in less than an hour, even with this wet and muddy ground. It had almost a full tank of gas, and I'm pretty sure I could outrun this mimic thing in it if I could get a straight shot down the service road. I definitely don't relish the idea, mind you. Every instinct is screaming at me to sit my butt right down where I am in this tower, and I know the ranger station will start getting a little antsy when Billy doesn't check in after a few days, but I'm also thinking they may extend it out a day or two in light of the foul weather. Maybe 5 days out in the wilderness, and then I'll have a ranger truck parked outside my tower. The question is, what they'll find when they get here. See, I've been thinking about it. Billy definitely knew more about this thing than I do. Certainly enough to not open the door when he heard it outside, pretending to be a Girl Scout selling cookies. That makes me think that maybe the fence and the trapdoor might not be enough to stop it if it really wants in. As Pants shittingly terrified as the prospect of leaving the tower and making for the Jeep is, sitting here cornered in my window-lined shack, just waiting for it to show up in the middle of the night, is worse. At least I have a chance out there. I still have the Magnum. It's been holstered to my belt since yesterday. They don't issue pea shooters for bear protection out here. This thing is the most powerful handgun in mass production. It'll put down anything in North America as long as you can hit it right. Any normal animal, anyways. Who knows what this thing is capable of? Still, it does provide a level of comfort and gives me some confidence that my plan may work. It's on my side for now. I'm going to try to eat a granola bar to put something in my churning stomach and try to build a little energy. I don't think I've eaten anything since yesterday. After that, I'm grabbing my pack and heading out. Wish me luck. I left my tower shortly after 10 a.m., and let me tell you, those were some of the most difficult first steps I've ever taken in my life. Stepping out through the chain link fence into that open space beyond my small compound felt like I was stepping off the roof of a skyscraper. When I closed the gate behind me, I stood there motionless. Must have been 5 minutes, frozen in place with my hand clenching the grip of my revolver that's holstered at my belt. Even with all the stress and anxiety swirling around in my head, I was amazed at how keen my senses seemed in that moment. I felt like I could hear every rustle of leaves and smell every damp patch of moss in the thousands of acres of wilderness surrounding me. In that moment, I felt very small, very insignificant, trivial. When my chest began to ache, I realized that I'd been holding my breath in subconsciously, afraid to make even the smallest sound. I let out a slow breath and forced myself to breathe normally again, scanning the trees. I turned slowly in a circle, eyes searching for anything that seemed out of place, like it didn't belong. But there was nothing there. Everything seemed normal, at least to me. Casting one last look over my shoulder at the refuge of my tower, I started off along the seldom-used service road to the north, careful of my footing on the muddy and uneven ground. I allowed myself to move at a slow jog, fast enough to make good progress, but not so fast that I was announcing my presence to the world. Not so fast that I couldn't hear the forest around me over my own breathing. I stopped a couple of times during my trek to catch my breath and take a drink of water, and thankfully still seemed alone and unpursued for now. I wondered if it was out there somewhere among the dense trees, hiding in the muted gray shadows of the forest. Or perhaps it had returned to my tower in my absence and found it empty, and was even now tracking my flight along this trail. If I paused long enough, would it suddenly appear, rounding the gentle curve behind me as it caught up to me in order to prefer to move more stealthily among the trees and underbrush, laying in wait alongside the path ahead, ready for my approach? I had to forcibly shake myself of that line of thought. It wasn't doing me any good now. I was committed to my plan. The thought of retracing my steps and returning to my lonely watchtower held just as much terror, because now it's out there, unmanned, unwatched, and abandoned. For all I know, the mimic could be there at this very moment, ransacking my shack. I definitely didn't want to walk in on that little scene. I can promise you that much. I ended up making surprisingly good time on that northern path. It was only about 30 minutes before I saw the dim shape of my Jeep waiting dutifully in the middle of the path ahead. The matte tan paint job and black cloth roof stood out remarkably well against the muted greens and browns of the surrounding forest. Urging my pace to quicken, I covered the last 100 yards before I even realized it and found myself standing at the door, hand on the handle. I paused. A chill ran down my spine, inciting an unbidden shiver, and I realized then how quiet the forest around me was. I wasn't sure how long it had been this way. I felt that something was out of place, and so did the native fauna. On any given day, the trees were alive with the sounds of wildlife. Squirrels and chipmunks chittered, insects buzzed, and 1,000 varieties of birds called and sang from the treetops. Not now, though. Now it was as if they had all left. It felt very alone in that moment, only not quite alone. Somewhere out there, in that sea of trees, something stalked, something that didn't belong in the light of day, something that didn't belong under the watchful eyes of Mother Nature. I was pretty sure she wouldn't have let something like the mimic evolve had it not been hidden in its underground realm. The door of the Jeep was thankfully quiet as I depressed the latch and swung it open. If this had been a horror movie, I'm sure an ear-splitting screech would have erupted from its hinges. But in real life, we tend to take care of these vehicles pretty well. In the best of times, they are the only convenient transportation for 20 miles or more. In times like this, though, it was likely the only thing that would save my sorry ass. I jumped in and pulled the door shut behind me with a dull thunk, subconsciously locking it. I almost laughed when I did that. The entire top of the Jeep was nothing more than canvas and plastic windows. A feisty hamster could probably have penetrated my little haven, and I doubt the mimic would even think twice about it. The Jeep fired up immediately when I turned the key in the ignition, and I threw it in reverse for the most ungraceful 14-point turn you've ever seen on the narrow and muddy service road. Once I got it turned around, I didn't waste any time directing it the way I'd come. The service road was really little more than an uneven and ill-maintained dirt trail, and was only ever used infrequently by the rangers and lookouts. As I'd previously mentioned, it was a rough ride, even for the heavy suspension of my trusty steed, so I had to keep it at a reasonable speed. The very last thing I needed was to snap an axle or bounce myself right off the road and into the trees. Considering the condition of the trail, with the fact that it constantly wound and curved as it progressed, it meant that even my best speed wasn't much faster than I could run on foot. That's okay. Once I got past my tower, the service road was generally better maintained and followed a more or less straight path. I'd be able to build some decent speed there and be out of the wilderness and standing at the ranger station in an hour or so. The abrupt appearance of my tower caused me to feather off the gas as I rounded the last curve from the northern track. I slowed to a crawl and squinted through the now dirty windshield. From here, everything looked exactly like I had left it. The gate still stood closed, and looking up, I could see the trapdoor also appeared shut. Maybe this thing hadn't returned. Hell, maybe this thing wasn't ever going to return. For all I knew, I was headed in the opposite direction. It's not like looking at a GPS on it or anything. It was at that moment that I nearly pissed myself when the radio, still clipped to my belt, squawked, and I heard probably the last thing I had ever expected to hear. "John, are you there?" The signal was pretty clear, but his voice sounded weak, strained. I almost didn't respond. I was frozen in indecision, clouding my mind. I didn't know what I could trust to be true, but I doubted that this mimic had read the radio manual and learned how to operate the handset. I snatched the handset from my shoulder and keyed the mic. "Billy? Holy? Is that you?" He answered me right away, and I thought I could hear relief in his tone, buried under his pained words. "John? Thank God. I was afraid you were gone." My eyes drifted to the trail leading past my tower toward the ranger station, toward safety. Another 5 minutes, and I would have been there. I got to my Jeep, and I was just about to haul ass for the ranger station when I replied, What's your status?" There was a moment of silence, and I wondered briefly if he hadn't even heard me. But then he answered, "I'm not doing too hot, John. I'm in my tower, but that thing hurt me. I've lost a lot of blood, and I've been drifting in and out. I've patched myself up as best as I could. I stopped the bleeding from my leg." He frowned and closed his eyes for a moment, asking a question I was pretty sure I knew the answer to. "Are you able to get back to your Jeep?" I thought I heard a coughing bark of laughter before he answered. "I don't think so. Pretty banged up, man. What happened?" "Billy, son of a... It got into my tower, managed to get a shot off, but not before it got a jump on me. I took off before it did me in, so I think I hit it. I don't know where it is now, though. My tower is wide open, and it hasn't come back, so maybe it's dead." I doubted that. Things never work out that simply. "Are you stable, Billy? Can you be moved?" Another silence, and then he said, "I know what you're thinking, John. Just turn your Jeep around and haul ass to the ranger station. That's an order." I dropped my forehead to the steering wheel, closing my eyes and cursing. It would have been easier if Billy hadn't radioed me. I know it's selfish. I know I'm an idiot for even thinking it, but I could have been blissfully out of range if he'd only waited for 10 more minutes. Still, I put the throttle down and got the hell out of there. I could still race for the ranger station, have them mobilize a chopper to come back for Billy. But they were at least an hour away. Factor in the spin-up time for the helicopter, and you're talking more like an hour and a half before anyone gets to him. It didn't sound good. Something told me it was unlikely he'd last that amount of time. I could still turn left. I'd likely live. But could I live with myself knowing that I left Billy to die alone in his tower? What if our situations had been reversed? Sure, I might be saying the same words he was saying now, but in my heart, I'd be pleading for that voice on the radio to help me. I couldn't imagine being in his position, lying there, hurt, bleeding out, knowing that his safe haven was wide open and that thing was out there somewhere. Look, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're probably saying already. Don't be a dumbass. This is exactly why everyone dies in a horror movie. I get it, believe me. I get it. But this wasn't a movie. My friend was lying there, dying in his shack. If I could get to him and get him into the Jeep, we could both get out of there, leaving this twisted nightmare behind us. Billy, I'm headed your way. Get ready, because we're going to wrestle you down the stairs and into my Jeep as quickly as we can, I said, cranking the wheel to the right and taking the western trail with more speed than I should have. John, I gave you an order. Get out of here now. Despite the situation, I managed to start a grin as my rig bucked and bounced over the uneven trail. Billy, I'd like to take this opportunity to officially tender my resignation from the Fire Watch. Now shut your mouth and conserve your strength. I'll be there in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Trying to be a pretty good guess, and before long, I skidded to a halt outside Tower 12, next to Billy's ride. I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet air, my handgun coming from its holster and held before me like some sort of shield. I took a quick moment to let my eyes roam over the surrounding woodlands for any sign of movement, before quickly jogging around my Jeep and toward the compound's entrance. I passed through an open doorway, taking note of the heavy chain-link gate that was lying twisted 15 feet inside the fence. Another dozen paces, and I was at the base of the stairs, craning my neck to make sure nothing was awaiting me above. I kept the mic on my shoulder and said in a low voice, Billy, I'm outside your tower right now, heading up. For Christ's sake, don't shoot me. I turned the volume on the speaker down just in time for his response. Damn it, John. I told you to leave. Despite his words, the gratitude and relief were clear in his tone. I started up the stairs, revolver still held at the ready as my other hand ran lightly up the railing. My eyes were drawn to the red-black spots staining the gray paint of the steel steps. I found even more of the viscous liquid on the railing as I continued my ascent. Blood, but not Billy's. God, I hope that thing is lying in the woods, breathing its last breath. He definitely hit it, but I had no way of telling how seriously it was hurt. In a human, red blood indicated an arterial bleed, which was typically a fairly significant injury. With this thing, who knew what black-red meant? I climbed the rest of the stairs around the tower and stopped just below the open trapdoor. "Billy?" I called cautiously. A pause, then came his reply, shaky and with a wheezing sound I didn't like at all. "How do I know it's you? Say something I couldn't have heard you say before." "I have always admired and respected you," I answered without hesitation. He said under his breath, "Come on up." I took another couple of steps, cautiously poking my head through the trapdoor. Billy was sitting upright, more or less, resting his back against the doorframe of his shack and aiming his own handgun generally in my direction. As soon as he saw my face, he dropped his hand to the side, the stainless steel barrel clanging against the metal walkway. As I stepped fully through the trapdoor, I noticed two things immediately. Firstly, there was a significant amount of that black-red goo splattered around. Secondly, I realized how badly injured Billy was. His face had gone gray with a sickly paleness, and his breaths came in ragged hitches. Blood-soaked bandages wrapped both forearms, and his face was covered in a crimson rag taped haphazardly down. His entire khaki park shirt was painted in a hellish tie-dye of shades of red, but it was his leg that worried me the most. A tourniquet had been tied around his thigh, and he was groaning, but the pants leg was a cherry red below that, glistening in the late morning light. "Jesus, Billy," I exclaimed, holstering my gun and rushing to his side. He waved me off, saying, "All beside me. I know it looks bad. Save it for later. Let's get out of here before that thing decides to come back for another round." I nodded and stood again, taking a quick glance past him into his shack. A twin of my own tower, normally Billy's looked like a war zone now. His table and desk had both been overturned and smashed, along with his base-set radio on the floor. On the floor nearby was a satellite phone, its antenna and display obviously smashed during the attack. Lifting his arm over my head, I helped him to his feet. He grimaced in pain, but threw his remaining strength in with mine, and we began the precarious descent through the trapdoor. "Did you at least get to make your phone call?" I asked him as we took the steps carefully and agonizingly slow. He shook his head. "Got here just as I was getting ready to. Excusing your voice, telling me that you were from the Park Service and you were here to help." He looked at me with a shaking astonishment. "Sounded just like you, John." I looked over the catwalk, railing down at it. He winced again as we stumbled on a step. "Almost there, John," he continued. "Well, yeah, I've never seen anything like it." I shook my head as we reached the bottom step and moved onto the rain-soaked ground. I grunted with exertion. "Save it, Billy. We've got a long ride ahead of us. Plenty of time for that later." He just nodded as I maneuvered him and ran to the passenger side of the Jeep and helped him climb in. Once he was in, I hurried back around to the driver's side door, got in, started the engine, and pulled the door closed behind me. Throwing it into reverse, I felt the wheels break loose as I stepped on the gas with a bit too much enthusiasm. I swung the 4x4 around and put it into drive, pointing it back toward my tower and beyond. Safety. I only had a heartbeat's warning from Billy before I saw it barreling from the underbrush at us. It threw itself, a great mass, crashing into the side of the Jeep, and Billy scrambled to get away from it, damn near climbing over the center console in the process and knocking my hands off the wheel. In a panic, the Jeep swung wildly left, and I stomped down on the brakes to avoid slamming into the trees. One of the front wheels dipped off the road, and the steel bumper crashed through a small cluster of oak saplings, halting us abruptly. The engine stalled, and everything went silent in that moment as we froze. My breath hitched in my lungs, and my eyes widened in shock as I laid eyes upon the abomination for the first time. My first impression was that it was much larger than I had thought, but the nightmare visage before me eclipsed such a pedestrian observation. The thing stood in the middle of the trail, still shaking its head as if trying to recover its senses after the collision with a 2-ton vehicle. It looked vaguely humanoid in a sense, but it walked on 4 limbs, clearly proportioned to such a task. It was hairless, and its mottled pink-gray skin stretched taut over muscles, bones, and odd, unidentifiable bulges. The limbs seemed to have joints that bent in all the wrong directions and ended in what had been claws, but instead of the distinctive keratin-composed sharp nails that seemed so familiar in the natural world, these seemed to be extensions of the creature's skeletal structure, protruding painfully through its veiny, translucent hide. The worst of all was the bulbous and disproportionately large head, topped with an oddly gaunt-appearing neck. It was oblong and reminded me of the shape of a feline skull. Its mouth seemed a jagged tear across its face, with ill-fitting and chaotically positioned teeth that didn't seem to allow the mouth to close properly. I couldn't see any eyes, but where they should have been, instead, there were two bulbous and cyst-like organs, seemingly bulging and flattening in a slow rhythm as if bladders were filling with air or liquid. I reeled back in revulsion as it turned its sightless head in our direction, searchingly. Flaps of skin on either side of its malformed snout opened slowly, like some obscene blossom composed of milky gray bat wings, and I had the sense that it was using them to try to somehow locate us. It was then I saw where Billy's shot had struck the creature in the face. One of the snout flaps was nearly completely severed, hanging limply in contrast to its sibling. A gouge furrowed by the bullet's travel creased along the right side of the thing's head, piercing and ravaging the bulbous organ on that side and leaving it a deflated sac. When it turned its head further in our direction, I could see clearly where it had bled significantly from the shot, but I was horrified to see that the wound had already sealed itself, leaving a shiny silver scar to mark the incident. "I knew I hit you, you bastard," Billy whispered, half to himself. The mimic stopped its motion, and we watched as the uninjured bladder on its head expanded like a half-filled party balloon. It dipped its head a bit, and we saw two membranous slits in the top of its skull dilate. A moment later, the twisted sound of a human voice assaulted our ears. "I know you're out there." The voice was unmistakably Billy's, but it was distorted and wrong. I thought that the wound from his gunshot probably had something to do with that. The thing raised its head again, turning a bit more in our direction. It took a few experimental steps forward, then paused and lowered its head. This time, we heard what sounded like the painful roar of a beast, almost perfectly replicated, except for that same distortion we had heard previously. "Killed a bear." I held my breath as we watched it again raise its head and take a few more contemplative steps in our direction, slowly swinging its grotesque snout back and forth. I could see how the flaps of skin that were flared open, where its nose should have been twitched minutely back and forth, and I felt like it was using them to listen for us. "Knows we're here somewhere, but he can't see us," whispered Billy, leaning close. "But if it gets close enough, I'm thinking we're done for." I looked over at Billy and realized that there was no way he'd be able to make a run for it in his condition. From the look of the thing growing ever closer to where we cowered in our Jeep, I thought it was likely we didn't have much time before it got close enough to hear our breathing, our heartbeats, or whatever, even inside the 4x4, and when that happened, I knew what would come next. Billy closed his eyes for a moment and turned to me. There was something in his eyes then, sort of acceptance. So he didn't like it one bit. "Get ready with the cannon," he whispered. "Only gonna get one chance at this." "What are you talking about?" I asked. A moment later, I had my answer. Billy took a deep breath and mustered every bit of strength to fling the door open and stagger out of the Jeep. "I'm right here," he shouted, limping weakly across the road from the Jeep. The mimic whipped its head in his direction instantly, but tilted its head to the side, seemingly momentarily puzzled at this unexpected turn of events. Billy held his own magnum in his hand, but it was too weak to raise it towards the beast. Still, he pulled the trigger, and a resounding boom seemed to shake the air. The mimic flinched at the defining sound of the gunshot, the flap of membrane at its snout snapping shut protectively. But its stunned hesitation didn't last very long. In an instant, faster than I would have thought possible, it launched itself on powerful limbs at Billy, knocking him to the ground and tearing at him with teeth and claws. I heard my friend screaming, then a horrible, soul-rending sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. But now was my chance, and I took it. I swung the door open and stepped out of the Jeep, my gun coming free of its holster in the same moment. The creature was preoccupied with what was left of Billy, but as soon as I brought the gun up and thumbed back the hammer, its head swung around at me. It crouched like a compressed spring, preparing to launch, but I was quicker. The report of the gunshot was incredible, and the recoil from the powerful round rocked my wrist back painfully. The beast staggered, and I saw a burst of blood and tissue explode from a wound where its shoulder met its neck. It howled an otherworldly cry, sounding like a bedlam mixture of man and beast. But though the wound seemed terrible, it tried once again to throw itself at me. I was set on my course, though, and took step after step toward the creature, pulling the trigger again and again until the gun ran dry. All I was left with was the clicking of the hammer and a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The acrid smell of gunpowder stung my nose, and by the time I finally stopped, I found myself within only a few feet of the horrific thing. 6 blackened holes stippled the neck and torso of the creature where the bullets had entered, and I knew that the destruction of their exits on the opposite side would be far worse. The mimic lay sprawled across the ruined body of Billy Johnson, its weight crushing whatever had been left of my friend. Black-red blood spread out from beneath the thing's bulk like an oil spill across a smooth floor. I noted with some muted surprise that the creature still twitched and slowly flexed its powerful muscles, and a wheezing sound was quietly emanating from the slits on the top of its skull. I holstered my empty handgun and scanned around the ground for what I knew was there. A moment later, I spotted it. Billy's own Magnum, lying half buried in the muck where it had been torn from its grip under the weight of the monster. I snatched it up and shook it clear of most of the mud and grass. Opening the cylinder, I saw that only one unfired round remained. That was enough, though. I approached the horror before me without apprehension or pause, my eyes focused on this thing that had caused so much pain and terror. I thumbed the hammer back and placed the muzzle against the mimic's head, which still convulsed with some small remaining life. I didn't know if it would be able to heal from the wounds I had already inflicted. Logic told me it was unlikely, but the silvery scar I'd seen from Billy's previous encounter caused me to question everything I thought was possible. I felt the tremors from the creature vibrate through the gun as the barrel rested against its skull, right between where its eyes should have been. I tensed my finger on the cold steel of the trigger, and the crack of the gunshot echoed throughout the forest. It was done. But even as I walked back numbly to the Jeep and restarted the engine, I wondered if that was true. I thought back to the journal I'd read, written more than 130 years before, and how it alluded to the tales of this creature going back long before then. As I drove the Jeep along the rough and winding service road, I wondered at the possibility that what we encountered was the only one of its kind. That the same beast had somehow terrorized cultures separated from each other by great time and distance, spawning the legends that the author of the journal and his companions pursued. It didn't seem likely. And now the door was open.